Hey everyone, welcome back. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 951. Acts of Sword Cultivators. The two talismanic boats directly entered Cloudtop City, with Shenzhenza personally welcoming them. Su Xingjiu eloquently explained the events that had taken place, recounting guest Elder Su's sinister schemes and attacks as well as spiritual master Huan Yun's timely arrival and protection. Afterward, they had come across this like-minded friend, a mighty senior who had previously purchased talismans at their market. Traveling together, they had then overcome many challenges in the immortal abode ruins that were filled with countless mechanisms and traps. Shenzhenza was astonished by what he heard. Su Xingjiu and the others had truly walked on a tightrope between life and death. As for how they had ultimately escaped from danger, even Huan Yun was completely in the dark, to say nothing of Su Xingjiu. Thus Shenzhenza became increasingly convinced that his two disciples had experienced great fortune while traveling around the martial world to train, and it was because of this that they had managed to avoid death and return to Cloudtop City in one piece. Not only that, but they had even managed to return with a few treasures from the White Jade Brush Shaft. This was an outstanding achievement. Shenzhenza immediately split the 4 treasures up, handing them to spiritual master Huan Yun, the mighty senior with the surname Chan, Su Xingjiu and Zhao Qingwan. Each person received 1 treasure. Huan Yun was unable to decline the offer no matter what, so he had no option but to enjoy the first choice for one of the 4 treasures. That being the case, he chose the immortal treasure with the worst quality and the worst grade out of the lot. Chan Ping'an was very direct, and he boldly chose the treasure that he liked the look of the most. This was a couplet with a blue base, golden characters and cloud and bat patterns. A meter-long sword amid the wind and rain outside the mountains, brandishing the sword and leaving the mountains when matters arise. A room of books amid the flowers and birds in the clouds, sages arriving when perusing the books without worry. Su Xingjiu let Zhao Qingwan choose first, and there was a sulky look in her eyes when he told her to go first. Su Xingjiu recalled the guidance from the senior sword immortal, so he immediately pushed aside his hesitation and picked one of the 2 remaining treasures. This was a critical matter that pertained to the betrayal and defection of one of Cloudtop City's chief guest elders, so the celebration feast that only had 5 guests in attendance quickly concluded and dispersed. Shenzhenza naturally needed to go over the matters again and again with Su Xingjiu. He didn't doubt his most valued direct disciple, but he was worried that Su Xingjiu had overlooked some critical details, things that he, Su Xingjiu's master, could help amend. Truth be told, there were many times when Shenzhenza felt like he, a golden core tier city lord, was an unworthy master for Su Xingjiu. However, he couldn't say this glaring truth out loud, and he could only keep it hidden in his mind. When they arrived at the secret room in Shenzhenza's cultivation abode, Zhao Qingwan quietly sat to the side as she always did, watching her senior brother discussing matters with their master. However, upon thinking of the fact that Su Xingjiu, who respected their master the most, was actually trying his best to deceive their master today, albeit with no malicious intent, Zhao Qingwan couldn't help but let a smile creep up the corners of her lips. This was a fresh and interesting matter that she wouldn't have even dared to imagine before. She lowered her head to hide her smile, but as she continued to smile, tears eventually started to silently roll down her cheeks. Shenzhenza noticed her abnormal state, and he asked in a soft voice, "What's wrong, Qingwan?" Zhao Qingwan was slightly flustered, not knowing how to respond. Su Xingjiu smiled and replied, "Master Qingwan always called herself a hindrance before leaving the mountains to train, but she was only saying this as a joke to me at the time. However, looking back at the events now, she discovered that this was actually the truth. Because of this, she's been crying and laughing the entire way back. Don't mind her, master, I'll scold her after we leave, what with her mental cultivation not being up to scratch. After I scold her, however." Su Xingjiu started to chuckle by himself. "What's the matter?" Shenzhenza asked in puzzlement. Su Xingjiu stood up and bowed in respect, saying in a solemn voice, "Master, I earnestly ask you to allow Qingwan and me to become Dao partners." Shenzhenza roared with hearty laughter, replying, "Will it be of any use even if your master doesn't agree? The 2 of you will disagree with my disagreement." Zhao Qingwan looked up, and she was filled with grief and happiness as she buried her head and started to sob loudly. Shen Zhenze looked at Su Xingjiu, with a slightly solemn expression on the golden courtier cultivator's face. Su Xingjiu shook his head with a limpid look in his eyes. Shen Zhenze didn't probe any further. When it came to golden courtier cultivators in the world, there were those with solid foundations and those with fragile foundations, and there were also those with superior cultivation and those with inferior cultivation. Regardless, their intelligence was far above that of ordinary people. Perhaps grand feats like golden courtier cultivators killing nascent tier cultivators were extremely rare. However, golden courtier cultivators scheming against nascent tier cultivators to harm or kill them was a very common occurrence. Of course, this wasn't unique to golden courtier cultivators, and it was the same for cultivators at all tiers. As such, how could one afford to be careless on the path of cultivation? Chen Ping'an temporarily stayed at a residence in Cloudtop City. This was none other than the private residence of guest Elder Su, the Dragon Gate tier cultivator who ranked below only Shen Zhenze in Cloudtop City. He didn't have any relatives, nor did he have any disciples. Thus, Chen Ping'an was able to settle down in peace and quiet. Right now, Huan Yun was sitting in a scenic viewing pavilion atop the peak of an artificial mountain. The two people were once again sitting opposite each other. When will this journey of examining the conscience draw to a close? Huan Yun asked. Chen Ping'an bent down and retrieved an item from his bamboo case, something that Huang Shi had gifted him back then for the sake of not needing to owe him a favor. This was a dark green abstinence plaque crafted from walrus ivory and decorated with cloud patterns, measuring 1 inch in width and 2 inches in length. This plaque could be worn near the chest, and its base material appeared the same as the colored glazed tiles used for the Taoist temple sitting atop the mountain peak. However, there was also a slight difference, but this was a feeling that Chen Ping'an was unable to put into words. There was only a single ancient seal script character on the front side, heart. On the back side was a line from a poem. The gullies beside the fields are dark and hazy. The sun and moon through the doorway shake one's soul. This is a Taoist abstinence plaque, although they aren't very popular nowadays. Huan Yun only took a quick glance at it before saying in an indifferent voice, "The Taoist sect has always had the saying, Tao gathers and presents itself in an unoccupied and peaceful mind, being unoccupied implying a pure state of the mind." When in reality, the three teachings all have roughly similar concepts. Chen Ping'an held the plaque in his palm and slowly rubbed it as he chuckled. "So you do understand these principles, and you understand them even better than me. But it's a shame that my cultivation base isn't as high as Sword Immortals," Huan Yun replied with a smile. "Is one reasonable and correct because of their high cultivation base? Or does one possess a high cultivation base because they're reasonable and correct?" Chen Ping'an asked. "The cultivation bases of qi refiners are often unrelated to their principles," Huan Yun replied. "That makes a little sense," Chen Ping'an said with a nod. "I still need to thank you for not directly visiting my residence," Huan Yun said. Chen Ping'an lightly placed the abstinence plaque on the table, after which he retrieved the two other items gifted to him by Huang Shi. One was a jade bracelet inscribed with a palindrome poem, with embers of light shimmering inside the bracelet. The other was an ancient-looking tree gall pot that was slowly absorbing spiritual energy. These were all valuable and high-grade items. It was simply the case that Chen Ping'an was unable to decipher just how outstanding they truly were. Huang Shi's large bags had only appeared so large because he had been carrying a large item around. When Huang Shi had adjusted his large bags to retrieve the treasures, Chen Ping'an had listened to the faint clanking sounds and guessed that Huang Shi had also obtained another incredible fated opportunity. Apart from that large item, there were still at least 7 or 8 other miscellaneous items. However, Huang Shi had given Chen Ping'an 3 of these items in the end. Even so, he had still obtained a huge number of treasures. In any case, regardless of how high the quality and the grade of Huang Shi's remaining treasures, they still couldn't be as good as the Taoist scripture owned by Lu Guibao, nor as good as the badge owned by Sun Qing. Chen Ping'an was only privy to these matters due to the nature of his personality. It wouldn't matter even if he were oblivious to these matters. After all, he definitely wouldn't try to fight Huang Shi for these treasures. Would it make any difference whether he was aware of these matters or not? Of course it would. It would make a colossal difference. A person's heart and thoughts were like flowing water and a riverbed. The flowing water was a minor component, with countless matters undergoing a myriad of changes in the world. A person's character was the riverbed, and if one could control it completely, it could then become a large stream, a large river, or a deep waterway. In the end, these waterways could ultimately flow into the sea like flood dragons. Chen Ping'an was walking along the rivers for the sake of Chen Lingjun, the little boy in azure. In reality, however, was Chen Ping'an's journey and cultivation of the mind not a case of a dragon rearing its head in his mind and silently crossing the rivers and waterways? To kill Huan Yun or Zhao Qingwan with 1 or 2 sword strikes or 2 or 3 punches, would this be very difficult? Not at all. However, the act of always choosing the easier options most likely couldn't be regarded as cultivation. The base material of the jade bracelet is good to begin with, and there's even a poem that a mighty talismanic figure has transformed into a talismanic formation, Huan Yun continued. With the passing of time, it's almost as if fire has appeared amid the water. As for the Treegall pot, this is something that can help chi refiners absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. At the same time, it can automatically temper spiritual energy into an energy that's suitable for wood element spirit treasures. The Treegall pot isn't an immortal treasure, but in the hands of some chi refiners who are specifically cultivating wood element immortal techniques, it's a valuable treasure that's even more precious than many immortal treasures. This explanation saved Chen Ping'an a lot of trouble in the future. He definitely wouldn't sell the Treegall pot, and even if he sold the jade bracelet, it would definitely be for an exorbitant price. However, Chen Ping'an still asked, "How many snowflake coins do you think this bracelet can sell for?" "Why not ask how many grain rain coins?" Huan Yun questioned. Chen Ping'an shook his head and remarked, "Sure enough, old spiritual master can't succeed as a wandering merchant. You're not very adept at counting money." Huan Yun gave a price: 2 grain rain coins. Even to golden core tier cultivators like the Rainbow Sparrow Residence's Sun Qing and the Water Dragon Sex Bai, 1 grain rain coin was still a significant sum of money. Many middle 5-tier vagrant cultivators under the golden core tier, especially those at the abode tier and the sea observation tier, most likely couldn't scrap together 1 grain rain coin's worth of belongings, especially when disregarding their bonded items. Even wealthy vagrant cultivators wouldn't carry grain rain coins on them for no reason, instead choosing to carry some lesser heat coins to prepare for rainy days. Moreover, when it came to spending money, it was very easy to exchange lesser heat coins for snowflake coins at any immortal ferry station in the world. "Old spiritual master has very good appraisal skills," Chen Ping'an said with a smile. "Having good appraisal skills isn't enough. At the end of the day, it still can't compare to the carefree nature of sword immortals." Huan Yun replied with a bleak expression. "Old spiritual master, you need to change your bad habit of disliking other people's strengths," Chen Ping'an said. Huan Yun chuckled coldly and mused, "As a measly golden core tier cultivator, how can I, Huan Yun, dare to ignore the teachings and principles of a sword immortal?" Chen Ping'an shot a glance at him and said, "I'm afraid that after listening to some principles with much difficulty, you'll still fail to accept them and adhere to them." Huan Yun fell silent. However, Chen Ping'an smiled and continued, "I'm a bit better than old spiritual master in this regard, and I'm most fond of listening to other people speak reason in a calm and collected manner. Old spiritual master, how about we discuss the knowledge relating to talismans? We can challenge each other's understanding and stand to gain mutual benefit." Huan Yun looked at the young man, someone who was truly unpredictable. The old spiritual master felt extremely uneasy, and the displeasure in his mind pushed him to say in a mocking voice, "How about I directly retrieve a few secret talismanic texts and place them on the table? And I'll open them up and turn the pages whenever Sword Immortal Chen asks me to? How about that?" Chen Ping'an paid no heed to Huan Yun's words, carefully putting the jade bracelet and the Treegall pot back inside his bamboo case. He then smiled and opened a package inside the bamboo case, retrieving an item and forcefully slamming it on the table. It was a brick that he had plucked from the paved ground of the Taoist temple atop the mountain peak. Huan Yun closed his eyes and started to rest his mind. This brick could perhaps be treated as a prized treasure for many ordinary immortal forces. Chen Ping'an thought for a moment before taking out some paper and ink, using his calligraphy brush to carefully sketch the buildings belonging to the ruins of that immortal abode, especially that white jade arch bridge. The only structure that he wouldn't sketch in a casual manner was that Taoist temple atop the mountain peak. After finishing his 2 sketches, Qian Ping'an asked, "Care to help me, old spiritual master? Can you sketch those large structures located at the back of the mountain?" Huan Yun suppressed his anger and retrieved some paper and a calligraphy brush from his pocket treasure, starting to sketch the structures according to Qian Ping'an's request. Qian Ping'an stood up and walked around the stone table, watching the old spiritual master sketching the large structures as he remarked with emotion, "Your drawing is indeed a bit better than mine." As expected of a mighty figure from the talismanic branch, Huan Yun was just about to stop drawing. Qian Ping'an prepared to raise his hand. Huan Yun had no option but to continue drawing. This couldn't be helped. Qian Ping'an was speaking in a polite manner, but he was also holding a gray brick in his hand. The next day, Cloudtop City's Shenzhenza insisted on buying the caisson ceiling of the immortal abode that was currently being stored in the private courtyard. The Golden Courtier City Lord appeared extremely determined, with his tone sincere as he claimed that he would purchase this valuable immortal treasure even if it meant selling a large number of his belongings. This was an immortal treasure that could stabilize the mountain and water fortune of a region, so he was even willing to pay with all of the stores on a certain street of Cloudtop City. Qian Ping'an didn't agree straight away. In reality, Huan Yun also had thoughts about purchasing this incredibly valuable caisson ceiling. He just didn't dare to ask. Shenzhenza wanted to ask for Huan Yun's help in convincing Qian Ping'an, but Huan Yun immediately felt a throbbing headache when he thought about the gray brick in that young man's hand. With this in mind, he chose to politely decline Shenzhenza's request. Shenzhenza had chuckled in frustration at the time and remarked, "Good one, spiritual master Huan. Perhaps you want to compete with me for this treasure." Huan Yun didn't feel guilty or embarrassed, and he replied frankly, "This is a rare fated opportunity, so we'll compete fairly using our abilities." Shenzhenza could only begrudgingly accept this. However, he also said that since this treasure had already been placed in a residence in Cloudtop City, it should logically be kept and used in Cloudtop City as well. Huan Yun smiled and said, "Watch your step when you leave. I won't see you off this time." Shenzhenza huffed and left in anger. Qian Ping'an made another trip to the market outside Cloudtop City, acting as a wandering merchant once again. However, he only peddled talismans and nothing else this time. He squatted on the side of the road with his hands inside his opposite sleeves, not shouting to attract the attention of the passers-by. He simply explained a few things when people stopped to ask questions. Qian Ping'an had seen an announcement in the newspaper just then, saying that vagrant cultivator Huang Shi was going to battle against martial artist Xiaonyang on Temper Mountain in 2 days' time. Qian Ping'an naturally wouldn't miss this event. Following Huan Yun's departure yesterday, Qian Ping'an had started to carefully take inventory of his yield from his treasure hunting trip. He had obtained the shattered wood fragments belonging to the deity statues enshrined in the Taoist temple. He had obtained 36 gray bricks from the Taoist temple. He had also collected a total of 122 green glazed roof tiles. There were the droplets of water from the tip of the green bamboo leaf inside his sword-nurturing gourd. Of course, there was also a vast amount of bamboo leaves and bamboo branches. He was temporarily nurturing an orb of shattered sword chi in his sword-nurturing gourd. There was the book that Qian Ping'an had eventually obtained but still hadn't read yet. There were the 4 items that Huang Shi had gifted him on 2 separate occasions: the copper mirror, the abstinence plaque, the jade bracelet, and the tree gall pot. In reality, he also needed to count the wisp of concentrated spiritual energy that he had absorbed into his Tao robe while inside that pavilion. He had also waded through the river of time once again. This morning, old spiritual master Huan Yun had also entrusted that little child to Shenzhenza, asking a guest elder to secretly take the little child back to his mountain. Qian Ping'an naturally wouldn't stop them from doing this. Without first easing one's mind, how could one calm the mind and cultivate the mind? People rested when the night grew old, and this was the state of tranquility espoused by the Taoist sect. This was similar to burning the first incense stick in Buddhist temples. In reality, the time and the location didn't matter at all. Qian Ping'an suddenly looked up with a smile, greeting the visitor who had stopped at his stall. Su Xingjiu squatted down on the other side of Qian Ping'an's stall, and he didn't know what to say first, even though there were a million things he wanted to say. "Still doing well?" Qian Ping'an asked. "Still doing well," Su Xingjiu replied with a radiant smile. That's good to hear, Chen Ping'an said with a nod. Can I purchase some talismans from Senior? Su Xingjiu asked. Of course. All visitors are customers, Chen Ping'an replied. However, the prices of the talismans won't change. Also, don't take out the treasure that you obtained earlier. I won't accept it here. There was an awkward expression on Su Xingjiu's face. He had indeed come here with immortal treasures. Not one but two. As for immortal coins, he hadn't brought a single one with him. This was a miscalculation on his part. After having a heart-to-heart conversation with Zhao Qingwan last night, both of them felt like they should offer their respective treasures as an expression of gratitude. Chen Ping'an smiled and said, I won't be there to drink the celebratory wine at your wedding. If you feel guilty, then just treat these treasures as my wedding gifts to the two of you. Then I won't disturb Senior's business for too long, Su Xingjiu replied. Chen Ping'an waved a hand and said, If you truly want to thank me, then help me attract some willing victims who are weighed down by immortal coins. I'll try my best, Su Xingjiu said with a wry smile. You're actually taking my joke seriously? Chen Ping'an chuckled. If you have the choice, then it's best to avoid doing things that go against your conscience. Su Xingjiu squatted there in dazed silence. Chen Ping'an pinched his forehead and sighed. I was just making a casual joke. Don't take everything so seriously, okay? Do you not find it tiring? When I observe Senior's speech and actions, all aspects are in harmony with the Great Tao. Su Xingjiu changed the topic and said. Chen Ping'an's forehead almost became drenched in sweat as he stated, My mountains aren't currently recruiting disciples. Su Xingjiu was extremely confused by this remark that had seemingly come from nowhere. Even so, he still respectfully bade farewell and took his leave. What an impressive senior sword immortal. Every single word of his was filled with mysterious and profound meaning. Standing further away on the street was a graceful young woman who didn't dare to walk over to meet this so-called wandering merchant. Chen Ping'an looked over and smiled, nodding in acknowledgement. Zhao Qingwan curtsied in response. Su Xingjiu held her hand, and Zhao Qingwan lowered her head. Su Xingjiu looked at her and softly said something. Chen Ping'an held his hands inside his opposite sleeves as he watched this slightly familiar scene. He felt like even though the human mind was wavering and impermanent, there were ultimately still reunions amid the mountains and waters. This was truly as good as could be. However, one small blemish was the fact that his business as a wandering merchant was far worse than before. He only sold a few talismans after an entire day, making a measly 30 snowflake coins. Chen Ping'an arrived at the residence left behind by guest Elder Su. He squatted down in the courtyard and carefully cleaned the caisson ceiling that was resting diagonally against the wall. Chen Ping'an occasionally breathed onto the caisson ceiling as he cleaned it, and he would almost need to press his head against the ceiling to do this. Huan Yun stood nearby with a strange expression. Was this truly a sword immortal who could travel around the world with Lu Jinglong? Huan Yun finally opened his mouth and asked, Why did you ask me to send a letter to the ancestral hall of the Rainbow Sparrow residence using a talisman paper? Why do you want Sun Qing and Wu Kun to come here and view the caisson ceiling? Chen Ping'an stood with his back facing the old spiritual master, and he replied, If Su Xingjiu and Zhao Qingwan are viewed as anomalies in your mind, then Sun Qing and the two other people from the Rainbow Sparrow residence can be regarded as anomalies as well. Moreover, they're anomalies that can very easily attract disaster. Since this is your perspective, I want to see whether I can transform these anomalies into beneficial matters while I continue to earn large sums of money. Regardless of whether the caisson ceiling is sold to the Rainbow Sparrow residence or not in the end, Sun Qing and the others should still feel gratitude toward you for this opportunity. In fact, you've also said yourself that Sun Qing, and especially her disciple Lu Guibao, are both very smart and straightforward people. That's even more reason for you and me to give this a try. Why are you helping me like this? Huan Yun asked. Chen Ping'an used his sleeve to gently clean the exquisite pictures on the caisson ceiling, not turning his head back as he replied in a slow voice, I'm helping the old mister who helped me enjoy a good opening to my business. The heart's barrier is difficult to overcome, Huan Yun sighed. Looking at the mortal world outside the mountains, the arrival of the new year brings about many hardships, but the new year is still celebrated yearly all the same, Chen Ping'an said with a smile. Huan Yun fell silent again. I can't help you with the water dragon sex, bye-bye, Chen Ping'an said. She's the disciple of a large sect, so a measly vagrant cultivator and wandering merchant like me will feel nervous and terrified whenever I see her. Truth be told, she's also facing a headache right now, Huan Yun said. I can find an opportunity to secretly meet her and resolve this hidden danger. After all, the Rainbow Sparrow Residence's Sun Qing and the Water Dragon sex Bai were seemingly oblivious to Elder Su's schemes to harm Su Xingjiu and his companion, but in reality, they actually knew everything. What they didn't know about were the events that had taken place afterward. It was a fortune that the two Golden Core tier cultivators didn't know about these events. Rather, only the young sword immortal standing in front of Huan Yun was aware of what had taken place. I feel like it's not too late to have the mighty cultivator from the Water Dragon sect come to seek you out first, Chen Ping'an said. Only this type of favor can be regarded as a true favor in the eyes of someone like Bai. Otherwise, if you stay guarded against my big mouth and I remain anxious about you selling my treasures, it will ultimately reach a point where we hunt for opportunities to kill each other for the sake of achieving peace of mind, no? I'm sure that if you remain at Cloudtop City for the near term, showing yourself in public a few times or traveling to the Northern Pavilion Nation or the Celestial Water Nation to enjoy the scenery, the Water Dragon sect will eventually take initiative and pay you a visit. That will definitely be better than you and Bai having secretive and suspicious discussions behind closed doors. Huan Yun faltered for a moment before smiling and saying, that will naturally be best. The next morning, the Rainbow Sparrow Residence's Sun Qing came to visit Cloudtop City with her disciple Lu Guibao. Shen Zhenze almost stomped his foot and swore. However, there was nothing more he could do at this moment. When the two talismanic boats had entered the city back then, the true appearance of the gigantic caisson ceiling had been forcibly revealed for a brief moment due to reasons pertaining to the mountain and water restrictions and the large protection formation. There were presumably secret pawns of the Rainbow Sparrow residence at the marketplace, and these pawns would have immediately sent letters to the Peach Blossom Ferry Station to inform them of the situation. This was completely normal. After all, Cloudtop City had also installed secret pawns at the Peach Blossom Ferry Station. Shen Zhenze wasn't so small-minded that he would directly prohibit Sun Qing from entering the city. However, he shamelessly made his way to the residence holding the caisson ceiling as well. If Sun Qing offered a higher price than him, could Shen Zhenze not maliciously raise the price even if he couldn't afford the caisson ceiling? Doing so wouldn't cost him a single immortal coin. At that time, if Sun Qing angrily abandoned her pursuit of the caisson ceiling, Shen Zhenze could grit his teeth and genuinely part ways with a large sum of his wealth to purchase the valuable treasure. In fact, Shen Zhenze could even offer a large swathe of Cloudtop City's land. If this still wasn't enough, then he would take on a debt or shamelessly borrow some grain rain coins from Huan Yun. Standing in the courtyard, Chen Ping'an looked at the livid Sun Qing, as well as the carefree Shen Zhenze who was leisurely raising the price. Huan Yun was also unsure about the actual value of this caisson ceiling, only saying that it definitely wouldn't be unfair to give it an asking price of 80 grain rain coins. Chen Ping'an stood there with a stern expression, also showing a hint of innocence and a slight dash of helplessness. In reality, he almost couldn't stop himself from giving Shen Zhenze a big thumbs up. Shen Zhenze had already raised the price to 86 grain rain coins. Judging from Shen Zhenze's attitude, he could stand here from morning until night and raise the price to 1,000 grain rain coins. Shen Zhenze, enough is enough. Sun Qing snapped in a cold voice. Shen Zhenze smiled faintly and asked, is Residence Head Sun planning to reluctantly part with this treasure? Then I'll have to thank Residence Head Sun on behalf of Cloudtop City. Lu Guibao remained silent the entire time. There were also two other people who had entered the courtyard together with Shen Zhenze. They were both familiar faces, Su Xingjiu and Zhao Qingwan. Lu Guibao didn't feel too much curiosity about the young man in black, who wasn't carrying a sword on his back today. Mighty figures from the mountains were involved in many strange matters after all, and in any case, his appearance wasn't actually that handsome even after he tore off the old man face mask. There was nothing interesting to look at. Instead, she secretly observed Su Xingjiu and Zhao Qingwan a bit more, attempting to find some clues. Perhaps old spiritual master Huan Yun purposely turning a blind eye to the actions of Cloudtop City's guest Elder Su back then, was because he was very confident in achieving his objectives? It wasn't because he wanted to borrow someone else's blade to strike his targets, killing two birds with one stone and being able to safeguard his reputation while also obtaining treasures? If this were truly the case, then old spiritual master Huan Yun truly deserved a newfound respect from her. In the depths of Chen Pingan's heart, however, he still hoped to sell the caisson sealing to the Rainbow Sparrow residents. Even though Taoist Master Sun had already left the majestic world, Chen Pingan could clearly tell through his speech and actions that he genuinely felt a strong sense of pity regarding Lu Guibao. Even though Taoist Master Sun hadn't taken the young girl as his disciple, saying that their Tao didn't align, he had still given the young girl that Taoist text. From Chen Pingan's perspective, he couldn't continue to carry such a large millstone around with him as he traversed mountains and crossed rivers, so he might as well go with the flow and sell the caisson sealing to the Rainbow Sparrow residents. Taoist Master Sun had gifted him so many fated opportunities, after all, so he felt like he needed to do a little something for him as well as a token of gratitude. Only by doing so would he feel at ease. He felt this way even though the two of them might never cross paths again for the rest of their lives. Of course, this was unless Chen Pingan genuinely became an Ascension Tier Greatsword Immortal one day, giving him an opportunity to travel to the heavenly world. When it came to some matters that could be done or could be ignored, and doing them would allow one to feel more at ease, then one didn't need to hesitate any longer. In any case, this wouldn't delay him from making money. Sun Qing suddenly used her mind's lake to communicate with Chen Pingan, proposing, "Young Master Chen, I'll offer you 30 grain rain coins and give you a minimization treasure on top of that. What do you say? Give me a straight answer on whether you accept this or not. If you don't accept, then I'll leave right away. Rest assured, young Master Chen will still be an esteemed guest of the Rainbow Sparrow residents." I, Sun Qing, never beat around the bush to speak in a complimentary manner. Minimization treasures were naturally very precious, but to Sun Qing, the residence head of the Rainbow Sparrow residence, the caisson ceiling that could stabilize the mountain and water fortune of a region was the most precious paramount treasure. Chen Pingan was clearly very surprised. He hesitated for a moment before replying, "Then I'll accept the offer of 30 grain rain coins. You can keep the minimization treasure, and you can hold a debt for the remaining grain rain coins first. Residence head Sun can repay me a sum of grain rain coins representing the value of minimization treasures in the mountains in the future." However, Sun Qing surprisingly rejected Chen Pingan's suggestion, saying, "Minimization treasures are useless to me at the moment, and this will be the case for the next 100 years or even the next several hundred years. On the other hand, each grain rain coin is useful to the Rainbow Sparrow residents. There's Wu Kun, Lu Guibao, and so many other cultivators, with each of them needing immortal coins for their cultivation. I can't delay their cultivation by giving away more immortal coins. So, young Master Chen, what's your answer? Are you going to sell me the caisson ceiling or not? In any case, I mysteriously obtained that minimization treasure, and it hasn't been locked as of yet. I was just about to refine it to a preliminary stage when I received old spiritual master Huan's secret letter, so I wiped away all of the existing restrictions. Young Master Chen can use it straight away." In the end, Sun Qing said boldly, "Even if this transaction falls through, the amicable relationship between us will still exist. Young Master Chen will still be an esteemed guest of the Rainbow Sparrow residence. However, the next time young Master Chen visits us, it's difficult to say whether you'll be served ordinary tea or be treated to our specialty tea." Chen Pingan held back a smile and replied using his mind's lake, "Then I'll accept your offer of 30 grain rain coins and an additional minimization treasure. Deal!" Sun Qing exclaimed aloud with a hearty laugh. She didn't try to conceal the fact that she had already reached a deal with young Master Chen. Shenzhenzi felt slightly disappointed, but nothing more than this. It was his fortune if he succeeded, and it was his fate if he failed. Sun Qing turned around and said to Shenzhenzi, "I managed to purchase this treasure at Cloudtop City, so I'll regard this as me owing you a favor." Shenzhenzi smiled and nodded in response. He then flew away on the wind with Su Xingjiu and Zhao Qingwan. Huan Yun gifted the Rainbow Sparrow residents a talismanic boat. Sun Qing accepted it without hesitation, not turning down the gift. Otherwise, was she supposed to soar through the sky with the gigantic caisson ceiling on her shoulders? Would that be appropriate? Did there exist such a shameless cultivator in the world? Sun Qing glanced at the caisson ceiling, after which she turned around to look at the young sword immortal with the surname Chan. She quickly came to a realization, thinking that Chan Ping'an most likely already owned a minimization treasure. Chan Ping'an guessed her thoughts, and he was extremely calm as he responded with a faint smile. Sun Qing felt a slight sense of guilt at this moment. Bloody hell, did she owe him another huge favor now? Chan Ping'an already had a minimization treasure to begin with, so her giving him another minimization treasure, one that she had only possessed for a short while, no longer appeared as valuable anymore. This caused Sun Qing to feel a slight sense of resignation. Forget about it. Chan Ping'an was Lu Jinglong's friend, so was there any need for her to be polite with him? Huan Yun tactfully took his leave. Sun Qing handed over the minimization treasure and the 30 grain rain coins. She then boarded the talismanic boat with Lu Guibao and the caisson ceiling and left Cloudtop City. The residence master of the Rainbow Sparrow residence couldn't wipe the smile from her face, and she immediately started to drink wine after the talismanic boat took flight. She didn't forget to look down at Huan Yun and say with a loud laugh, "Spiritual Master Huan, Cloudtop City is tiny and boring, and a fart in the east can even be heard in the west. So you should come to the Rainbow Sparrow residence if you have free time, and it will be even better if you become a guest elder." Shen Zhenze chuckled and scolded, "Utter nonsense. Spiritual Master Huan is already an unofficial guest elder of Cloudtop City." Huan Yun smiled and shook his head. He was in a fairly good mood right now. Standing in the courtyard with a new minimization treasure, it was as if a pressing issue had just been solved for Chan Ping'an. Like an ant moving nests, he started to sort through and categorize all of his belongings, both new and old. Huan Yun left and returned within 15 minutes. Chan Ping'an was already sitting in the pavilion atop the artificial stone mountain, cocking his head and listening to the crisp sound of 2 grain rain coins striking each other. Huan Yun sat down opposite him, smiling and remarking with emotion, "The room small but the world large, the heart compact but heaven and earth vast. I always felt like I understood this in the past, and it's only now that I've discovered that I don't understand it well at all." Chan Ping'an continued to tap the 2 grain rain coins against each other, nodding and replying in a casual voice, "Understanding that you don't understand is a preliminary form of understanding." In reality, Chan Ping'an still felt a slight lack of self-confidence as he spoke these grand principles to a golden courtier earth immortal who excelled at talismans. However, this didn't matter, and he was simply borrowing many of these sayings and phrases from his student Cui Dongshan. Huan Yun smiled and said, "If you trust me, then I'm preparing to travel around the mountains and waters of the northern pavilion nation." Chan Ping'an put away the 2 grain rain coins and sat up straight, replying, "Then I'll wish old Mr. all the best in overcoming your heart's barrier." "It's still too early," Huan Yun said. "Only when I can candidly explain this matter to Shen Zhenze and sincerely apologize to my 2 juniors can I truly untie the knot in my heart." Chan Ping'an nodded and remarked with a smile, "Old Mr. is as graceful as ever." Huan Yun stood up and bowed in respect, saying, "Take care, friend." Chan Ping'an also stood up, cupping his fists and replying, "Take care." Huan Yun flew away on the wind. There was still a talisman paper pocket treasure left behind on the table. Chan Ping'an put it away, treating it as something that was temporarily in his care. He wouldn't so much as open this pocket treasure. Afterward, Chan Ping'an started to carefully calculate the remaining natural treasures needed to refine his wood element bonded item. Cui Dongshan had actually helped Chan Ping'an put together a list before the latter left Downtrodden Mountain to journey around the northern complete reed continent, with the metal, wood, and fire element bonded items each needing different natural treasures to refine. Moreover, Cui Dongshan stressed that the listed natural treasures were only the bare minimum, and being in possession of these natural treasures could guarantee that nothing would go wrong. However, they were far from enough by themselves, especially since bonded items of the 5 elements essentially all came with their own unique circumstances and requirements. As such, Chan Ping'an needed to carefully explore and investigate after he obtained the relevant fated opportunities, as only by doing so could he genuinely succeed in refining the bonded items. Chan Ping'an was in no hurry to leave Cloudtop City. In any case, the immortal ship to the Dragon Palace Small World would stop at Cloudtop City. Apart from cultivating, Chan Ping'an continued to visit the market to act as a wandering merchant every single day. On this day, Chan Ping'an saw a familiar face at the market, Jin Shan. The vagrant cultivator almost fell to his knees and kowtowed when he saw Qian Ping'an, but after being stopped by Qian Ping'an, he squatted down beside the stall together with the young sword cultivator. The vagrant cultivator planned to return the unused defensive talismans and the last remaining steel-carrying talisman, which still had some spiritual energy, to this senior. Qian Ping'an didn't take them back, shaking his head and saying, "You can keep them. They're not worth much anyway." The vagrant cultivator insisted on returning them no matter what, even choking back tears as he spoke. It was a treasure-hunting expedition that hadn't appeared too dangerous to begin with, yet how many of those lofty cultivators with high cultivation bases had managed to make it out alive in the end? Jian Shan felt like he needed to have some conscience. It was because of this that he had insisted on traveling to Cloudtop City to try his luck, seeing if he, the pig butcher, could meet that double dammit again. Qian Ping'an finally accepted the talismans. He then smiled and suggested, "How about us two brothers enjoy some wine after I pack up for the day? I'll foot the bill, senior. Is that okay?" Jian Shan asked with a smile. Qian Ping'an nodded and replied, "That will be okay, but we won't be able to enjoy good wine anymore." Jian Shan cracked a grin upon hearing this. This was indeed the case. In the end, the vagrant cultivator treated his senior to some wine and acted slightly generously at his own cost. However, he didn't feel bad at all about spending this money. Cloudtop City had its own fleet of small immortal ships traveling back and forth. Jian Shan spent 1 snowflake coin for a ticket, and after boarding the immortal ship at the ferry station, he cupped his fists and bade farewell to the senior. The senior was as polite and easygoing as always, surprisingly cupping his fists to see him off. The immortal ship slowly flew into the distance. After enjoying some wine, and on the way to the ferry station, the senior had returned those talismans to Jian Shan again. Jian Shan had been left with no option but to carefully place the talismans in his sleeve. The senior had also urged him to return to his hometown, warning that the regions surrounding Cloudtop City were still relatively tumultuous. Jian Shan naturally didn't dare to doubt this. When drinking wine just then, he had discussed many trivial matters with the senior. For example, how his wife was virtuous and good at managing the family, how his 2 children were quite impressive and good at studying even though they were still young, and how they could definitely become top scholars or champion scholars in the future. After sobering up a bit, Jian Shan felt increasingly embarrassed as he thought about this. He slapped himself across the face. After disembarking the immortal ship and arriving at a secluded location, Jian Shan decided to hide the talismans in his boots instead. He couldn't help but feel a little uneasy about leaving them in his sleeves. However, only when he retrieved them did he discover the 2 gold paper talismans hidden between the other talismans. They weren't the original yellow paper talismans. Jian Shan stood there in a daze. He involuntarily recalled a remark by the senior from when they were drinking just then. Sword cultivators only seek satisfaction when they act. They don't speak reason. Su Xingjiu visited the residence with a large stack of newspapers, and he asked with a smile, "Mr. Qian is also keeping an eye on Temper Mountain?" Qian Ping'an accepted the newspapers and offered with a smile, "If you're not busy, then why don't you sit down and read some newspapers with me?" Qian Ping'an retrieved 2 pots of immortal wine and passed one to Su Xingjiu, with the 2 of them slowly enjoying wine as they sat opposite each other and flicked through the newspapers. Regarding the battle at Temper Mountain, the 2 parties were ranked next to each other in the list of top 10 young cultivators in the northern complete reed continent. Vagrant cultivator Huang Shi was ranked 4th, while martial artist Xiaonyang was ranked 5th. There were many new speculations about the reason for this life and death battle between the 2 cultivators in the most recent newspaper, with some people claiming that this was a mutual hatred born from love. There were also some who claimed that Huang Shi wasn't very old, yet he was far too apathetic when it came to killing people, and he had accidentally killed one of Xiaonyang's close relatives. Su Xingjiu retrieved a snowflake coin and lightly tossed it into the brush washer on the stone table, causing it to instantly disintegrate and transform into a wisp of spiritual energy that fused into the mountain and water fortune of Temper Mountain, which was located tens of thousands of kilometers away. All of the spirit tools and immortal treasures that could be used as enchanted picture scrolls in the world possessed the mystical ability to eat money. The great emblem sword sex Qi Jinglong had fought with Peace and Tranquility Mountain's Huang Ting on Temper Mountain not too long ago. with the two sword cultivators who were at the peak stage of the nascent tier causing noticeable damage to the fortune of Temper Mountain. Their battle had severely exhausted the spiritual energy of Temper Mountain, so a battle between upper 5-tier cultivators would presumably engulf an even greater volume of spiritual energy. That being the case, why was Temper Mountain still flowing with an abundant amount of spiritual energy? This was because countless spectating cultivators were pouring an endless amount of immortal coins into their enchanted picture scrolls. Su Xingzhou hesitated for a moment before asking in an uncertain voice, "Mr. Chan, if I have the opportunity to leave the mountains and embark on a distant journey in the future, can I go to the Great Emblem Sword Sect to visit Mr. Liu?" Su Xingzhou appeared slightly embarrassed as he added, "I've always greatly admired Mr. Liu." Chan Ping'an smiled and replied, "I can help you give some notice in advance, but I can't guarantee that Liu Jinglong will definitely meet you." Su Xingzhou's eyes lit up, and he immediately stood up and bowed in gratitude. "There's one thing you need to remember," Chen Ping'an continued. "Make sure to bring a few pots of good wine when you go to the Great Emblem Sword Sect to visit Liu Jinglong in the future. If you're truly able to meet him, you don't need to say anything, and you simply need to down some wine to show your respect. Liu Jinglong likes to drink, but he's generally not able to relax and indulge himself unless someone else takes the lead. Don't believe him if he claims that he doesn't drink. If that happens, then it's definitely because you haven't drunk enough yet." Su Xingzhou sighed with emotion and remarked, "So that's how it is. I understand. Sure enough, Mr. Liu is exactly like the terrestrial flood dragon that I imagined him to be. A sword immortal who's willing to subdue others through reason is definitely a sincere and carefree person." "Without a doubt," Chan Ping'an concurred with an earnest nod. Chan Ping'an looked at the projection of Temper Mountain above the stone table, and with a flick of his sleeves, the blue stone plateau immediately expanded into the surroundings. He and Su Xingzhou were like two magnificent deities who were personally descending upon Temper Mountain and standing on the stone plateau. However, the more important an area, the more restrictions it would naturally have. Moreover, the quality of the spirit tools being used as enchanted picture scrolls would also affect the quality of the viewing experience. Chan Ping'an discovered that if his guess was correct, then his porcelain brush washer would only be able to show them an extremely zoomed-out view of the battle between Huang Shi and Xiaonyang. In fact, the two cultivators would only appear as large as small grains of rice. Chan Ping'an had once asked Qi Jinglong whether the sword Qi of great sword immortals could borrow these opportunities to surge forth tens of thousands of kilometers and kill those atop Temper Mountain. Hearing this, Qi Jinglong had smiled and shaken his head, saying that those at the immortal tier might have a chance, but those at the unpolished jade tier didn't even need to dream about it. This was because the sword Qi of sword cultivators depended heavily on sword intent, so they wouldn't be as pure as the spiritual energy of immortal coins no matter what. In other words, this small impurity would cause the fragile spirit tools hosting the enchanted picture scrolls to immediately shatter. However, Qi Jinglong had also said that looking back at history, there were indeed some ancient mystical abilities and unorthodox techniques in the mountains that had allowed people to use enchanted picture scrolls as a medium, causing harm to those who had wanted to profit from streaming through the picture scrolls. Of course, cultivators who used these mystical abilities and unorthodox techniques needed to hide themselves very well, or else they would very easily become public enemies of an entire continent. For example, they might attract the attention of those lofty immortal tier cultivators or perhaps even those paramount ascension tier cultivators. There were still roughly 15 minutes until noon. Chan Ping'an suddenly noticed a subtle ripple in the sky above Temper Mountain. Shortly afterward, a person laughed heartily and asked, "Where is that unparalleled unpolished jade tier cultivator from the Jade Forest sect?" It wasn't long before another ripple appeared above the projection of Temper Mountain, with someone else replying, "What guidance does Senior have for me?" The person who had spoken first evidently spent another immortal coin, saying with a chuckle, "I regret giving birth to you." The unpolished jade tier cultivator, the esteemed sect leader of the Jade Forest sect, was truly someone with a good temper. Not only did he not insult the other person back, but he even spent another grain rain coin and said in a respectful voice, "You jest, Senior." The two of them didn't say anything else. However, someone suddenly smiled faintly and asked, "Have you made up your mind yet, sect leader he? If you don't say anything, then I'll take that as a yes." "That's definitely Su Xian," Su Xingzhou said quietly. Chen Ping'an nodded in response. Su Xian was the prized disciple of Bai Shang, the #1 greatsword immortal in the north. He was ranked second among the top 10 young cultivators, even above Qi Jinglong. A voice that was filled with vicissitudes sounded at this moment, exclaiming, "Oh? Am I about to drink celebration wine for Su Xian and He Xiaoyang's wedding? The two of them are a match made in heaven, so this old man will definitely drink the celebration wine. I already have a Dao partner," a woman revealed in a cold and aloof voice. Her words stirred up 1,000 waves. "Congratulations, sect leader He. Dare I ask, sect leader He, which esteemed person has become your Dao partner? My Dao heart is shattered, celestial maiden He. From today onward, the world is going to lose another deeply love-struck person." In the end, it was a remark from Su Xian that brought a halt to the rowdiness. "That's not an issue. You won't have an immortal Dao partner once he dies." He Xiaoyang chuckled coldly and suggested, "Why don't the two of us agree on a time to do battle at Temper Mountain? If you dare to kill him, then I'll dare to end the lineage of Bai Shang." Su Xian didn't say anything else. Su Xingzhou sighed in pity and remarked, "I didn't expect a lofty immortal like sect leader He to actually have a Dao partner. I genuinely wonder which man is enjoying such good fortune." However, he suddenly noticed the slightly grim expression on senior sword immortal Chen's face. Chen Ping'an lowered his head and drank a sip of wine, with his expression quickly returning to normal. It was almost noon. A ray of white light burst through the sky before hovering down onto the central region of Temper Mountain's Bluestone Plateau. On the perimeter of Temper Mountain, a woman wearing a veiled hat stepped onto the Bluestone Plateau with a long saber and a short sword by her waist. Chen Ping'an adjusted the misty projection of Temper Mountain, trying his best to capture both cultivators who were involved in the battle. As for the clarity of their faces, this wasn't important at all. In reality, most Qi refiners spectating the battle through enchanted picture scrolls very likely wouldn't be able to clearly see the exchanges between the two people. They were simply watching for entertainment. Indeed, many middle 5-tier cultivators were destined to only see the two people a very small number of times. At most, they would only see the dazzling light show resulting from the offensive immortal treasures and powerful immortal techniques. Thus, there was a popular saying in the mountains of the northern complete reed continent, if one wasn't a golden core tier earth immortal, then one didn't need to dream about catching the intricate details of the battles taking place at Temper Mountain. Regarding the background of martial arts grandmaster Xiaoyang, especially the origin of her martial arts skills, not a single report or newspaper in the northern complete reed continent could explain it clearly. Su Xingzhou quickly started to celebrate his decision to visit Chen Ping'an's residence rather than staying by his master's side to spectate the battle at Temper Mountain. When spectating the battles at Temper Mountain with his master, Shen Zhenze would frequently adjust the angle of the projection as well, continually zooming out at the same time. Even so, he would still miss many critical exchanges of the battles. In Su Xingzhou's eyes, his master's control of the projection couldn't compare to the precision displayed by Mr. Chen. Even though it was inevitable that they would still miss some key moments, Xiaoyang's elusive movement and her powerful punches, as well as vagrant cultivator Huang Xi's furious reign of immortal techniques and offensive immortal treasures, Su Xingzhou discovered that this was his first time experiencing a battle at Temper Mountain in such a vivid manner. Each exchange was linked with the next, allowing him to roughly understand the flow of the battle. Chen Ping'an was fully concentrated on the battle, continuing to change the angles of the projection as he watched. The strength temporarily displayed by Xiaoyang was that of a genuine far-roaming tier martial artist. Her fists were extremely quick, and her physique was incredibly strong. However, the female martial artist was yet to draw her saber or her sword. As for whether or not she was a mountain summit tier martial artist, they would wait and see. Even though the appearances and ages of martial arts grandmasters wouldn't be as difficult to distinguish as those of cultivators in the mountains, the higher the cultivation base of a pure martial artist and the faster their cultivation, the less of a direct relationship there would be between their appearance and their age. This was presumably even more true for female martial artists, also possessing the ability to delay the aging of their appearance. Huang Xi was an extremely young nascent tier cultivator, even a few years younger than Qi Jinglong. Indeed, the two prodigies ranked 3rd and 4th on the list of top 10 young cultivators were both yet to reach 100 years old. The existence of these cultivation prodigies put huge pressure on everyone else. Indeed, those golden core-tier Earth immortals who were 200 or 300 years old would be made to feel like they had wasted a huge chunk of their lives. The enchanted picture scrolls suddenly became blurry with the projection shaking in an unstable manner. Chen Ping'an faltered upon seeing this. Su Xingjiu hurriedly tossed a few snowflake coins into the brush washer, causing the projection to immediately regain clarity and stability. Chen Ping'an felt like streaming through enchanted picture scrolls was truly a brilliant way to make money with little effort and investment. However, if Downtrodden Mountain adopted this business tactic in the future, what would it rely on to make money? Perhaps Zhu Lian and Zheng Dafeng could become storytellers? Chen Ping'an was worried that the reputation of Downtrodden Mountain would take a huge beating. When its disciples left the mountains to train in the outside world in the future, perhaps the female disciples would be okay, but wouldn't the male disciples all be treated like criminals? Chen Ping'an was truly unable to think of any other avenue. Dragging Qi Jinglong to Downtrodden Mountain to work as a teacher for 1 or 2 Dao discussions. Having old cook Julian fire up his stove and cook up an entire table of scrumptious dishes? Or telling Pei Qian to perform her deranged demon sword techniques? Or perhaps asking Wei Bo to play Go with someone? Chen Ping'an pushed aside these thoughts and continued to focus on the battle. For some unknown reason, Xiaonyang and Huang Shi were in no hurry to battle to the death. Su Xingjiu was already becoming slightly dizzy from the action, and he quickly drank a sip of wine to suppress his astonishment. Chen Ping'an remained unmoving like a mountain, continuing to adjust the projection above the brush washer the entire time. Su Xingjiu felt increasingly impressed by this. How long did the longest battle at Temper Mountain last? Chen Ping'an asked. The longest battle in history was between an unpolished Jade tier sword immortal and an immortal tier cultivator, with one going all out to attack and the other going all out to defend. They were very evenly matched, and if I remember correctly, the battle lasted around a month or so, Su Xingjiu replied. Chen Ping'an massaged his glabella upon hearing this. Just how many snowflake coins would it cost to watch such a battle until the end? There was another battle between 2 sword immortals that exhausted all of the spiritual energy in Temper Mountain in just 1 hour. Su Xingjiu continued. This issue couldn't be rectified no matter how the spectating cultivators furiously tossed immortal coins into their enchanted picture scrolls, so as a result, only the residents atop a mountain near Temper Mountain could roughly spectate the remainder of the battle. However, it was said that the surging sword chi seeped out of Temper Mountain, forcing the Jade Forest sect to activate its mountain and water formation to prevent its mountain from being damaged. This cost the Jade Forest sect 100 or so grain rain coins, and they even needed to borrow a further 200 from other cultivators in the mountains, promising to repay this later and with interest. After experiencing this dangerous situation, the Jade Forest sect now has 300 grain rain coins permanently stored atop the mountain as a safety measure, not using these immortal coins for any other purpose. Spiritual energy coursed through Su Xingjiu's body as he suddenly stood up, planning to bid farewell and take his leave. Chen Ping'an smiled and said, "This is a good thing. You'll be able to ascend the building and observe the vast sea once the cave abode door opens." Su Xingjiu flew away on the wind. Cloudtop City had already prepared an area for him to break through to the sea observation tier. He had been on the verge of breaking through for the past few days, and all he had been waiting for was the right moment. After Su Xingjiu arrived, his master, Shen Zhangzi, would naturally look after his safety as he broke through. If Su Xingjiu was quick, then 3 to 5 days would be enough. If he were slow, however, then it might take anywhere from 2 to 3 years. No one could say for sure, nor was it the case that being faster would be better. Similarly, it wasn't the case that being slower would guarantee a more stable cultivation base. At the end of the day, this was all up to each person's fated opportunities. A gentle breeze rises from the body and its acupoints, seeing one's true nature through the depths of the still water. However, it was a shame that Chen Ping'an was still yet to come across such scenery. He was a third-tier chi refiner, and he had encountered some small obstacles and taken many winding paths. Chen Ping'an continued to spectate the battle. Atop Temper Mountain, both Xiaonyang and Huang Shi were brimming with killing intent. Even so, both of them were still feeling out each other's abilities, clearly looking for an opportunity to end the battle with a single decisive strike. Chen Ping'an had already spent several snowflake coins. He drank a few sips of wine. He only ever picked up snacks from plates and bowls, and since when had he ever needed to toss money into porcelain wares instead? These two people were being quite unkind to the spectators. 2 hours later, Chen Ping'an sat cross-legged on the stone chair, resting his cheek on one hand. There was already a small mountain of snowflake coins resting beside his arm. By the looks of it, the two of them could still fight for a very long time. Approximately 2 hours passed, and the tip of Chen Ping'an's mountain of snowflake coins had already been flattened. A mighty figure threw in one grain rain coin and scolded with a chuckle. "What a detestable couple the two of you make! Even if you want to love each other and hate each other, is there any need to waste the immortal coins of everyone else? Huangxi, you're a sword cultivator, so if you manage to leave Temper Mountain alive, you'll definitely have to face my sword strokes sooner or later." As it turned out, vagrant cultivator Huangxi was actually a concealed sword cultivator as well. Meanwhile, martial artist Xiaonyang had also given everyone a big surprise, unexpectedly being skilled at many immortal techniques. Even though it looked like they were tempering each other's cultivation, they were actually filled with strong killing intent as they attacked each other, so much so that Chen Ping'an felt slightly curious about what had taken place between the two of them to nurture such intense hostility, one that caused them to choose Temper Mountain, a place under the watchful gazes of everyone, as the location to decide their life and death. 15 minutes later, Chen Ping'an suddenly stood up and directly crushed a large pile of snowflake coins, transforming them into spiritual energy, and doing his best to maintain the projection formed by the porcelain brush washer on the stone table. Martial artist Xiaonyang seemingly summoned an extremely high-grade treasure from the mountains, with a brilliant light appearing like the sun as it illuminated the entire Temper Mountain. Even looking at it through the enchanted picture scroll, Chen Ping'an still found the dazzling light a little blinding. The mountain and water fortune of Temper Mountain was instantly stirred into a chaotic mess, also affecting the viewing experience of the cultivators spectating the battle through their enchanted picture scrolls. Chen Ping'an could only vaguely see a thin black line slicing through the dazzling light enveloping heaven and earth. A short moment later, atop the stone plateau of Temper Mountain, half of Huangxi's flesh had disintegrated, making him look like half a skeleton. Even so, he was surprisingly still alive, while the astonishingly capable Xiaonyang was already nowhere to be seen. It was unknown whether both her body and her soul had been annihilated, or whether she had managed to successfully flee into the distance during that critical moment of life and death. Huangxi stumbled forward a few steps before soaring into the sky and leaving Temper Mountain. Chen Ping'an couldn't help but sigh with emotion. As long as the cultivation bases of the two opponents were close enough, even a myriad of immortal techniques ultimately couldn't rival a single sword strike. A sword could shatter a myriad techniques. Chen Ping'an put away the porcelain brush washer and the small mountain of snowflake coins. He had reaped some benefits from spectating this battle. The fist techniques and the fundamental fist intent of martial artist Xiaonyang were hugely interesting, appearing to exist on another extreme compared to Gu Yu's mountain-shaking fist and Cui Cheng's fist technique. Chen Ping'an crudely emulated Xiaonyang's fist stance in the pavilion, slowly practicing walking meditation and throwing punches based on the techniques of the female martial artist. Chen Ping'an retracted his fists and stopped walking around the pavilion a short moment later, completely unable to capture the essence of Xiaonyang's fist technique. He wasn't able to emulate her fist intent at all. However, the benefits hadn't come from the fist stance anyway, and this was something that Chen Ping'an had already predicted beforehand. Rather, the true benefit was Chen Ping'an's broader understanding of fist techniques in the world, allowing him to be more prepared when he faced enemies in the future. Chen Ping'an shut his eyes and started to rest his mind, striving to better remember Xiaonyang's fist intent. This could serve as a good facade even if he were only able to roughly emulate her form. Chen Ping'an started to stroll around after opening his eyes, practicing the fist technique a few more times. After he felt satisfied, he involuntarily recalled a sad matter. He was running very short on gold paper talisman papers. There were only the last 10 sheets remaining. He needed to be very careful about what he used them for. Chen Ping'an was only a third-tier qi refiner right now, so apart from elementary talismans like the Yang Energy Illumination talisman, he was completely unable to draw any of the other ancient talismans recorded in the authentic death-avoiding book. In fact, Chen Ping'an found it easier to draw talismans even higher-grade talismans, as a pure martial artist rather than a chi refiner. However, it was a shame that talismans drawn by martial artists couldn't be sealed shut, leading to the spiritual light of the talismanic cores flowing away too quickly. Chen Ping'an retrieved the 10 gold paper talisman papers from his pocket treasure, and counted them one by one, again and again. Of course, there was no way that an extra talisman paper would suddenly appear from out of thin air. He left the pavilion and returned to his room, sitting down on the cushion after grabbing sword immortal from the wall. He placed the sword horizontally across his knees and took out his sword nurturing gourd, carefully guiding the orb of shattered sword chi out from the gourd. For 10 entire days afterward, that young wandering merchant no longer appeared in the market outside Cloudtop City to set up a stall and sell his talismans. In the capital of the Great Li Empire, the young emperor summoned his subjects to hold a small imperial meeting in his imperial study. 20 or so officials and generals gathered in the imperial study, causing the room, which wasn't very big, to appear slightly cramped. The eldest person in the imperial study was the old man Guan, the head minister of the Ministry of Personnel, and it appeared like the main imperial meeting before this had already drained too much of the old man's energy and spirit. He was nodding off in his chair right now, with a small and exquisite charcoal basket wrapped in cotton cloth sitting in his lap. This was an item bestowed upon him by the late emperor, and it was something that the eunuchs in the palace would help him look after. Whenever there were small imperial meetings during winter, someone in the palace would naturally bring this charcoal basket to old man Guan, who was already over 100 years old, without needing his reminder. Old man Guan was already snoring softly at this moment, but no one from the emperor to the high-ranking officials of the Great Li Empire showed any signs of wanting to wake him up. In any case, the elderly head minister would naturally wake up and give his input when they started to discuss topics that he regarded as important. A young assistant minister from the Ministry of Justice was currently reporting the conclusion of a critical matter to the important officials in attendance. The female cultivator with the pseudonym Shirqiu had already been rescued and taken away by someone, with her current whereabouts unknown. The cultivation bases of those in the 2 groups of guest elders and pawns from the luminous Vermilion Empire had varied from high to low, but without exception, all of them had been extremely cautious and meticulous, carrying out their tasks as steadily as experienced spies. They had first embarked on an intercontinental journey, traveling to the northern complete reed continent Ceremony Mountain to investigate the records of everyone on that downed intercontinental ship, hoping to find some critical clues and leads that pointed to the Great Li Empire colluding with Ceremony Mountain to assassinate the sword cultivator of the luminous Vermilion Empire. In reality, one of the 2 groups had already succeeded, and they had decided against taking an intercontinental ship back to the eastern treasured Vile continent, instead choosing to take a detour and travel across the sea. However, they had still been caught and killed by cultivators from the Great Li Empire. The most troublesome matter was that young woman from Ceremony Mountain, the one whose real name was Qiu Shi. She had unexpectedly exposed the truth through the enchanted picture scrolls, saying that it was Mr. Sword Earn from the northern complete reed continent who had committed the crime and was framing the luminous Vermilion Empire. Qiu Shi hoped that someone could deliver this news to Heavenly Lord Xie Shi, and she was even willing to die to prove the veracity of her account. The immortal force that had taken Qiu Shi and had already been sealed off and put under martial law by cultivators from the Great Li Empire. The pillar official from the Yuan clan was an old man with a thin face, and he rubbed his palms together as he commented with a faint smile, This small act truly has far-reaching consequences. I wonder what the esteemed Imperial Preceptor's Green Ripple Pavilion is busy with these days. The burly clan leader of the Chao clan was sitting back in his chair as he chuckled coldly. Even if the Green Ripple Pavilion makes some careless mistakes, it's still better than Yuan Yunshui, who only knows how to launch spittle in the Imperial Court. The Green Ripple Pavilion can at least make some tangible contributions, unlike Pillar Official Yuan, who can only scold the heavens, scold the earth, and scold his colleagues every single day. Yuan Yunshui, you're clearly the most capable when it comes to nitpicking things. The clan leader of the Yuan clan smiled faintly and replied, Chao, I'm currently still a pillar official, but as for you, I can't say for sure whether you still view yourself as a pillar official. The mind of the Ministry of Rights head minister was adrift the entire time. This was always the case. The head minister of the Ministry of Justice, who also managed many matters pertaining to mountains, waters, deities and ghosts, appeared much like an unremarkable middle-aged man if it weren't for the extremely eye-catching official robe that he was wearing. He actively spoke and injected himself into the spiteful argument between the two bickering pillar officials, saying with a stern expression, "Lord Chao, Lord Yuan, each word in this small imperial meeting can decide the fate and fortune of the Great Li Empire's citizens. That being the case, perhaps the two of you should put aside your differences for the moment." An old man from the imperial Song clan, who managed the imperial genealogical records of the Great Li Empire's royal family, chuckled and exclaimed, "Goodness gracious me! I almost thought the surname of the Great Li Empire's royal family was Yuan or Chao. As an old man with the surname Song, that truly scared me to death." There was a short but extremely stocky general who hadn't been able to go on an expedition south like Chao Ping and Su Gaoshan, and he looked quite strange and funny as he sat on his chair. However, the weight of his words couldn't be scoffed at, and he said in a solemn voice, "If we have so much free time to bicker, then we should make haste and dispose of that troublesome female cultivator from Ceremony Mountain. If the Green Ripple Pavilion likes to sit on its hands, then we can instruct my subordinate cultivators to take on this task. I can guarantee that even the mastermind who rescued her will be disposed of as well." The young emperor wasn't sitting behind his study table, and he had instead moved his chair closer to the other officials. Moreover, he had remained silent the entire time, sitting beside the fireplace and hunching over with his arms extended to warm them up. There was an ordinary boxwood chair beside him, and it had already been placed in this imperial study for 100 or so years. Several emperors of the Great Li Empire had grown up under the watchful gaze of this chair. The late emperor had touched the boxwood chair but never sat on it when he was little, and the same was also true for Song He. The dragon throne had already been through several emperors, but the seldom used boxwood chair had only been used by a single person this entire time. Standing in the corridor outside the imperial study, an old eunuch said softly, "The imperial preceptor has arrived." The high-ranking officials who had the right to participate in this small imperial meeting all stood up, with even old man Guan shifting his posture slightly and placing his hands on the armrests. It looked like he was finally awake, and he also stood up to welcome the arrival of embroidered tiger Cui Chan. The young emperor didn't stand up, but he retracted his hands and sat up straight. An old Confucian scholar stepped into the imperial study, bowing in respect to the emperor and not appearing haughty in the least. Emperor Song He smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. Cui Chan sat down and turned his head to look at the elderly head minister of the Ministry of Personnel who still had his hands on the armrests of his chair, asking with a smile, "Head Minister Guan, are you trying to stand up, or are you trying to sit down?" Old man Guan smiled with squinted eyes and replied, "Please forgive me, Imperial Preceptor. After growing old, everything becomes more difficult apart from occupying a spot and doing shit all. Let's discuss the proper matters," Cui Chan said with a wave of his hand. The atmosphere in the imperial study instantly became solemn once Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan arrived. Everyone involuntarily gathered 120% of their attention. "I want to take the opportunity today to explain the current state and future trends of the luminous Vermilion Empire, Bamboo Scroll Lake, and the Azure Phoenix Nation to everyone present," Cui Chan said. "If we're able to agree on the plan for each, then we'll have something to refer back to in the future regarding both the mountains and the regions outside the mountains in the eastern treasured Vile continent. Which is to say, today's meeting can be viewed as one that will decide the Great Li Empire's direction for the next 100 years. With this in mind, every single word uttered in this meeting will be recorded without fail. Who coughed how many times, who nodded off, who drank however many cups of tea, who uttered foolish and empty words that will detrimentally affect the nation, and who proposed far-sighted ideas that will build the fortune of the Great Li Empire. All of these records will be clearly visible to the rulers and officials who have the right to sit in this room in the future." In the end, Cui Chan continued, "Whether or not His Majesty can become the #1 ruler in the history of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, and whether or not the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire can tell everyone in the majestic world to obediently open their eyes wide, and take a proper look at the Great Li Empire and remember the names of our emperor and his outstanding officials and generals, all of this will depend on the words and actions of everyone present today." At the small imperial meeting in the imperial study, The young emperor slowly stood up, with a burning vigor raging in his chest. The scholarly officials stood up and bowed in respect. The military generals stood up and cupped their fists in respect. The shattered corpses of fallen deity statues littered some ancient battlefield ruin in the golden armor continent. The astral wind here would cause any chi refiner under the golden courtier to feel torturous pain worse than death, even if they only lingered in the battlefield ruin for a short 15 minutes. Many pure martial artists also like to visit this battlefield ruin to temper their physiques, but a large majority of them would fail to make it out alive. The suddenly rising gusts of astral wind were unpredictable and untraceable, with some as fine as sword chi that was as sparse and hovering down, and some like the sword strikes of sword immortals that were able to envelop entire areas measuring 5 kilometers in radius. There were many cases of astral winds sweeping by and dissolving the bodies of even Vajrabhati tier martial artists. A young woman who had once advanced as the most powerful 5th-tier martial artist in the world had only managed to drift around and reside in this battlefield ruin for several years thanks to an incredibly unique natural talent. Right now, she was unleashing thunderous punches at a slowly advancing young man in white. The young man was only at the Vajrabhati tier. The young woman could perhaps kill ordinary Vajrabhati tier martial artists with a single punch. However, she had already thrown several thousand punches at this Vajrabhati tier martial artist who was even younger than her. Yet without exception, they were all blocked by his fist intent. Simply put, her opponent wasn't fighting back at all. Yet as someone who had the opportunity to advance to the Vajrabhati tier from the strongest 6th-tier cultivation base, she was still unable to even touch her opponent. The young Vajrabhati tier cultivator in white was indeed only at the Vajrabhati tier. However, it was a shame that he was Chao Ci, who had embarked on a distant journey here from the Middle-earth divine continent. Each of Chao Ci's martial arts cultivation bases was unparalleled in history. The young woman had come here to train ever since she was a young girl, and she had once refused to believe the incredible strength of Chao Ci. Afterward, she had experienced eagerness, launched tentative punches, unleashed her full power, gradually slipped into despair, and finally entered a state of numbness. This was a string of complicated emotions. Chao Ci finally spoke for the second time just as she was about to stop her attacks, asking, "Your fist intent has been rising the entire time, so why do you want to stop?" Hearing this, the young woman gritted her teeth and continued to persevere, unleashing her fists in a furious manner. Chao Ci had spoken for the first time following Lu Yuzhou's remark. At the time, the pure white countenance Lu Yuzhou had taken advantage of the fact that he was standing beside Chao Ci to viciously insult the young woman, mocking. Huai Qian was correct. In Chao Ci's eyes, your 6th-tier cultivation base is as fragile as wet mud. Chao Ci hadn't wanted her to misunderstand, so he had spoken for the first time following their encounter, correcting, "I never said anything of the sort." Lu Yuzhou was squatting on the palm of a fallen deity statue right now, and a patch of lush grass and flowers had bloomed on the gigantic palm. This patch of grass and flowers surprisingly wasn't obliterated by the astral wind howling through the ancient battlefield ruins, and this was quite a strange matter. Lu Yuzhou was unable to understand the current situation. One person hailed from a top-notch immortal sect that had someone place in the top 10 cultivators of the Middle-earth divine continent in almost every generation, while the other person hailed from a powerful clan in the Middle-earth divine continent that produced a large number of martial artists, making this young woman and Huai Qian a very good match for each other. That being the case, why had both of them fled from the marriage and caused such a big joke? They weren't being asked to become immortal Dao partners, and they were only being asked to agree to a marriage in name. In any case, this so-called marriage wouldn't place any tangible restrictions on either of them. If it were Lu Yuzhou, he would even be willing to sell himself as long as the price was fair. Chao Ci was scanning the deity statues strewn across the battlefield ruins the entire time, looking over them one by one. He wanted to decipher some fist technique true intent. And truth be told, he was genuinely able to decipher a decent amount. Thus, the furious fists from the young woman were destined to be futile. This was because the increase in her fist intent would undoubtedly be much slower than that of Chao Ci. Chao Ci stopped in front of a broken deity statue that only had half its body remaining, gazing up at the figure that had seemingly been slashed apart by a sword from its shoulder to its waist. The barefoot young woman dressed in white stopped throwing punches and lowered her head, bending down as she placed her hands on her knees and vomited large mouthfuls of blood. Lu Yuzhou's skin crawled, and he felt like every single talented pure martial artist in the world was insane. Qi refinement was indeed better after all. As long as one had enough immortal treasures, one could safely hide in their shell. For example, he had accompanied Qiao Ci for a great distance during his trip to train in the outside world, having traveled to the Flowing Dawn continent and now traveling through the Golden Armor continent. Apart from several paramount Dao robes, Lu Yuzhou also owned 2 suits of incense god spirit armors. However, he had already gifted one to his friend, Huai Qian, several years ago. They were nothing more than simple friends. They weren't like-minded people, and their friendship was born from the relationship between their 2 clans. This was essentially one clan becoming friends with another clan. In saying this, Lu Yuzhou actually had a decent relationship with Huai Qian, who was unwilling to take advantage of him. This was unlike many of his so-called friends and brothers, who always wanted to temporarily borrow some immortal treasures from him, the single child of the pure white continent's god of wealth. In reality, there were many times when Lu Yuzhou had wanted to say something to those friends, who borrowed immortal treasures from him with no intention of ever returning them. It wasn't that these people were very smart, but rather, he had suffered the bad habit of feeling uncomfortable all over unless he gave away money and treasures from a very young age. Fortunately, his parents never tried to restrict him in this regard. There was one time when Lu Yuzhou had sincerely gifted a treasure to a good friend in a rare display, yet he had discovered afterward that the person hadn't viewed him as a friend at all. Lu Yuzhou had only been 10 at the time, and he had bawled his eyes out in absolute grief. Seeing this, his father had led him to the treasure storage mountain of the Lu clan, a genuine mountain of treasures. The wealthiest man in the continent had then asked his son, "Assuming you give away 1 treasure every single day, how many days will you need to live to give away this entire mountain of treasures?" Lu Yuzhou had performed some calculations and provided an accurate answer. His father had then waved a hand and opened a secret restriction, causing an even larger and more magnificent mountain of treasures to materialize behind the existing one. There were truly mountains beyond mountains, and the dazzling iridescent glow of the treasures had almost blinded the young Lu Yuzhou. Lu Yuzhou had immediately burst into tears. How was his family so wealthy? On that day, the young child had swaggered away from his clan's restricted lands with a large number of treasures hanging from his body and clanging against each other. A wide smile had returned to the child's face, and he hadn't forgotten to wipe his tears and snot on his father's sleeve. The same day, however, the pure white continent's god of wealth, who wasn't fond of disciplining his son too much, had taught Lu Yuzhou an ancestral teaching from their clan's ancestral hall. Earning money has always been easy. What's difficult is accumulating wealth without inviting disaster, and spending money without courting calamity. Afterward, he had recounted some tragic and bloody lessons from the history of their clan to his son. It was only at that moment that Lu Yuzhou finally understood the truth. If a large clan with immense wealth wasn't careful and wise, only focusing on how to earn more money using the same old methods as before, then it was more likely than not that earning more money would be inviting disaster, and spending this money would be courting calamity. Lu Yuzhou had only been slapped by his father once in all his years. That time, a clan with whom they had a long-standing relationship but liked to earn dirty money against their conscience had experienced some trouble, and Lu Yuzhou had helped a pitiful friend who had been crying and begging for his help, lending him and his clan some money to overcome their difficulties. He had even consoled his friend and helped him scold the culprit responsible for the troubles. Of course, Lu Yuzhou had also expected to receive his rightful compensation in full. However, Lu Yuzhou's father had appeared immediately following his friend's departure, brutally slapping Lu Yuzhou and causing his face to drip with blood. He had asked Lu Yuzhou whether he understood his wrongdoing, and Lu Yuzhou had replied that he shouldn't have lent money to his friend and his clan. This response had earned him another slap, directly knocking him to the ground. Lu Yuzhou had fallen silent after struggling to sit back up. His father had chuckled coldly and remarked, "What's wrong with keeping business business? Money is the cleanest thing in the world." Even until today, Lu Yuzhou still hadn't heard the remaining half of the answer from his father. Perhaps the answer was written on the piece of paper that the old ancestor of commercialism had given the old ancestor of the Lu clan back then. There was a small number of characters written on the piece of paper which the clan leaders of the Lu clan had always kept enshrined in the ancestral hall. Wealth nurtures conscience, the lack of which dissipates the former. Lu Yuzhou sighed as he squatted in the patch of grass and flowers blooming in the palm of the broken deity statue. Every family had its hardships, and he hoped to become the clan leader of the Lu clan later rather than sooner. That way, he wouldn't need to question his conscience all the time. Lu Yuzhou used his mind's lake to ask Chao Ci in the distance. Say, when will Huaiqian return from the northern complete reed continent? Chao Ci replied with a nod. Lu Yuzhou rolled his eyes. This was Chao Ci's response, showing that he had never thought about this question before, and would never think about it in the future. Lu Yuzhou would often ask him some random questions, and Chao Ci presumably felt like it would be rude to completely ignore him. Thus, he would often nod or give to acknowledge Lu Yuzhou's questions. The young woman felt like an opportunity had come for her to take advantage of, yet after unleashing a punch with her full power, a loud crack came from her wrist. When she hovered to the ground and stood still, she shook her shoulders and found that one of her arms had already become limp. Lu Yuzhou raised his hands and gently massaged his temples, thinking that encouraging Chao Ci to visit this battlefield ruin so that he could borrow the opportunity to take a look at the young woman who had rejected a marriage with Huaiqian was actually a bad idea. Thus, Lu Yuzhou started to contemplate whether this young woman, who had most likely achieved the strongest 6th-tier cultivation base in the world, needed any immortal treasures. He had many immortal treasures that she could feel free to take. Even if these treasures weren't useful for her, she had already left home for many years, so would there not be some juniors for her to give them to when she returned home? These immortal treasures could be treated as New Year's money for the children. Following the Dragon Spring Prefecture's promotion to a province, a new governor from the Yellow Court Nation, a vassal state of the Great Li Empire, arrived near Downtrodden Mountain. There was also a new provincial city god, and at the residence with the plaque reading Beautiful Water Noble Wind, the Yin god of the Gu clan was promoted thanks to his contributions, seemingly ascending to the heavens with a single step as he became the mountain god of the Great Li Empire's old northern mountain. Meanwhile, the female ghost wearing the wedding dress also returned to her residence, living in seclusion and seldom venturing out. Only the river god of the embroidered flower river would visit her from time to time. Regarding the mountain gods of the Great Li Empire's previous 5 mountains, 4 of them had been reassigned to other mountains in the eastern treasured Vile continent. Thus, apart from the largely unknown Yin god of the Gu clan, 3 mountain gods of the Great Li Empire who had toiled hard and made great contributions were also rewarded with promotions, becoming mountain gods of the old 5 mountains. Even though they weren't formal gods of the 5 mountains, they had already become first-rate mountain gods of the eastern treasured Vile continent, who were ranked below only the mountain gods of the new 5 mountains. The northern mountains Wei Bo had already entered seclusion. The entire region around Cloud Drape Mountain was heavily guarded and on high alert. The imperial court of the Great Li Empire viewed this matter with great importance, and with the exception of Sage Ruanqiong, even Su Ruo was especially sent over to protect Wei Bo as he broke through to the next tier. Zhu Lian and Zheng Dafeng were playing Go at Downtrodden Mountain. Chan Lingjun, the little boy in azure, had spectated the Go game for a while, yet this had caused him to become extremely sleepy, eventually putting him to sleep. He snored loudly and drooled all over the table. Seeing this, Zheng Dafeng placed a hand on Chan Lingjuan's head and twisted it around, using his face to wipe away the mess. He then pushed the young boy's head further away from the Go board. Zhu Lian rubbed his chin and said slowly, "Even if we host another night travel banquet following Wei Bo's breakthrough, we'll still be facing quite a sizable hole in our finances. If that still doesn't work, then we'll send a letter to our mountain master who's busy traveling around and sightseeing, asking him to cough up some treasures to fund his mountains," Zheng Dafeng suggested. He's been wandering around the northern complete reed continent for so long, and he's even managed to trick beautiful young ladies into coming to the eastern treasured Vile continent, so I refuse to believe that he doesn't have some spare change lying around in his pockets. Zhu Lian smiled and replied, "Brother Dafeng, your writing is beautiful, and your calligraphy works are truly a pleasure to read. I'll leave the letter writing to you, and I'm sure that young master's mood will definitely improve when he reads your letter." There were 2 young girls sitting side by side opposite Chun Lingjun, with the young girl in black being Zhou Mili and the little girl in pink being Chan Rushu. Zhou Mili immediately coughed upon hearing this exchange. Zheng Dafeng turned around, feigning shock as he exclaimed, "Where did this great water monster come from?" Zhou Mili crossed her arms and replied, "What a coincidence! I'm also from the northern complete reed continent, coming from a place called Mute Lake." A thunderous boom traveled over from the bamboo building. Zhang Dafeng's eyelids twitched and he immediately said in a righteous voice, "Forget about it, let's continue to play Go. We'll accept fate and let destiny decide the matters relating to money." Zhou Mili hung her head in a dejected manner. Chen Rushu gently offered her a handful of roasted seeds. Zhou Mili shook her head, not having the appetite to snack. Chen Rushu bade farewell, putting away the roasted seeds before running to the bamboo building with Zhou Mili. The commotion on the second floor would probably stop in about 1 hour. It was the same every day. Chen Rushu and Zhou Mili needed to boil some water before heading to the second floor of the bamboo building to carry away the limp and unconscious Pei Qian. Night arrived. Pei Qian bared her teeth and grimaced for a long time before jumping around and stretching her muscles. Only then did she pretend to be energetic and refreshed as she walked out from the first floor of the bamboo building. Chen Rushu and Zhou Mili were sitting on 2 small bamboo chairs near the door. Pei Qian reached over and grabbed the hiking pole from Zhou Mili's hands. Zhou Mili exclaimed in surprise and started to clap, with a bright glimmer in her eyes as she cheered. "You've mastered the divine technique." Pei Qian nodded and replied, "The old man on the second floor also thinks the same, saying that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, or at most 2 days after tomorrow, might be the last day that he can teach me any new fist techniques." He was shedding tears as he spoke, and his old and blurry eyes were filled with respect for the formidable younger generation. Standing on the second floor, Cui Cheng chuckled and asked, "Practicing fist techniques at night is also pretty good, isn't it?" "What nonsense are you spewing, Zhou Mili? Can fist techniques be mastered in just 1 or 2 days?" Pei Qian fumed. Zhou Mili scrunched her face and replied in an aggrieved voice, "I was wrong." Pei Qian secretly raised her thumb. What a brave and upstanding companion. As expected of the right guardian of Dragon Riding Alley's pastry shop, her loyalty was truly unwavering. On the other hand, the left guardian who ran around wildly all the time truly deserved a beating. "You're not going to run along and help Sun Yuanji train?" Cui Cheng asked. Pei Qian nodded and walked to an empty space outside the bamboo building, looking up and asking, "What % of my power should I use?" "That's up to your mood," Cui Cheng replied. Pei Qian thought for a moment before frowning and starting to carefully contemplate this matter. This old man was truly as wicked as could be. Helped Sun Yuanji train? He was clearly hoping that Sun Yuanji would give her a beating. "No? I don't care about your mood, but if you don't piss off soon, my mood will most certainly take a turn for the worse," Cui Cheng warned. Pei Qian sighed in grief and vigorously made a face at the second floor of the bamboo building, lightly tossing the hiking pole back to Zhou Mili after a short period of silently baring her teeth and swinging her arms. She held one hand behind her back and lightly clenched her other hand into a fist, twisting her foot and sending up a plume of dust with a loud thud. Her skinny figure dashed away like a wisp of fleeting smoke. Sun Yuanji was currently practicing walking meditation on the steps of Downtrodden Mountain. Her body suddenly tensed, causing her to look back. Someone's fist gently tapped her forehead, after which they shot past her and disappeared in a flash. Sun Yuanji was drenched in sweat as she looked in the direction of the disappearing figure, only to see a familiar and skinny figure. She was standing atop the thin branch of a tall pine tree, with one foot on the branch and the other foot on top of this foot. Sun Yuanji knew that Pei Qian had recently been practicing fist techniques on the second floor of the bamboo building. However, just how many days had this tanned young girl been practicing fist techniques for? "Big Sister Tsin, I was only greeting you just then, and I'll be helping you train now," Pei Qian said in a serious voice. "But you're older than me, have trained for longer than me, and are taller than me, so you're not allowed to go too hard on me. You need to go easy on me." Sun Yuanji took a deep breath and assumed a fist stance, saying in a solemn voice, "Please go ahead." It was as if she were facing a formidable enemy. This caused Pei Qian to feel slightly panicked. What was this all about? Weren't they going to feign some exchanges and have a perfunctory fight like the fights between her and that large white swan? Pei Qian hesitated for a moment before hurriedly retrieving a talisman and sticking it on her forehead. She was going to muster some courage first. By the looks of it, she needed to treat this training session seriously. Otherwise, what would she do if Sun Yuanji beat her half dead with a single punch? Pei Qian was distinctly aware of just how earnest big sister Tsun was as she practiced fist techniques every single day. She practiced both day and night, walking up and down the mountains again and again. The old cook always commented that this was the tenacity that needed to be displayed by those practicing fist techniques. Pei Qian tapped her foot. The thin branch under her foot bent significantly but didn't snap, following which it snapped back as she shot forward and vanished from the tree. Sun Yuanji faltered for a brief moment, and she was immediately struck in the back by the young girl's fist, causing her to tumble down the mountain. As Sun Yuanji flew through the air, the young girl's elbow smashed into her back, causing her to violently smack into the steps, with her body bouncing up once before falling still. Her eyes then rolled into the back of her head as she lost consciousness. Pei Qian hovered to the ground and squatted down, with her forehead dripping with sweat as she furiously wiped her face. What in the world was going on? Zhu Lian and Zheng Dafeng exchanged a glance as they stood at the top of the steps. Pei Qian hurriedly adjusted the talisman on her forehead and secretly nudged Sun Yuanji. At the same time she turned around and shouted, "Good heavens! This truly has nothing to do with me." Sun Yuanji fell down and knocked herself unconscious. I'm too weak to lift her up. Die. On an immortal ship that sailed past Cloudtop City, and was imminently about to arrive at the Dragon Palace Small World, Chen Ping'an was dressed in azure and leaning on the railing with Sword Immortal on his back, and a luggage sack slung diagonally across his shoulder. It wouldn't be long before he reached 2 million punches. He wondered how Pei Qian was doing at Dragon Riding Alley. How was she doing at the private school? Did helping around in the shops affect her transcriptions? And was she getting along with that great water monster from Mute Lake? Chen Ping'an heard and witnessed many strange things during his time on the immortal ship. A group of female cultivators in colorful robes had played on a swing beneath the sea of clouds, with their silvery laughter and chatter drawing many whistles and shouts from the male cultivators on the immortal ship. The two parties were going to pass each other and never meet again in the future, so the comments from the male cultivators became slightly crude and wanton. However, a colossal flood dragon head had slowly stuck out from the sea of clouds, stunning many cultivators on the immortal ship into silence. The mystical being, which wasn't actually a genuine flood dragon, had used its head to gently ram the stern of the immortal ship, causing it to shoot forward like an arrow. Chen Ping'an committed this scene to memory, and after returning to his guest room, he continued to go about his day as usual. From Stalactite Mountain to the northern complete reed continent, since parting with Lu Tai to accidentally entering the Lotus Flower Blessed Land, and leaving the Taoist temple with Pei Qian and the 4 martial artists from the picture scrolls, Chen Ping'an had started to record some of his experiences based on his memory. Starting from his departure from Stalactite Mountain, then to his encounter with Lu Tai, his arrival in the northern complete reed continent, and his trip through Sky Calling Street of the Planchette Writing Sect, these records continued all the way to today's encounter with the Flood Dragon Head pushing their immortal ship in the sea of clouds above the northern complete reed continent. There were 2 stacks of paper on the table. Chen Ping'an had separated them into a draft stack and a transcript stack, with the former containing crossouts and corrections and appearing much like an undelivered letter. However, this letter was becoming longer and longer as he continued to record his experiences. Meanwhile, the transcription was neat and tidy, looking like a piece of homework written by a student for their teacher. Sometimes there was genuinely nothing for Chen Ping'an to write about, having not come across any interesting scenery, people, or matters for an extended period of time. When this happened, Chen Ping'an would either write nothing or he might occasionally write. Today was uneventful and peaceful. Everyone had fought for the right to ascend in the Lotus Flower Blessed Land, and Chen Ping'an had unleashed his swords and fists at the most powerful person in the Blessed Land after being trapped in a deadly battle. He had encountered a noble scholar who was good at writing limericks at an inn on the border of the Great Quan Empire. He had wandered around with his Een soul and come across the short-tempered water goddess of the Burial River, after which he had visited the Green Roving Residence and expounded the theory of sequential order to the water goddess, who greatly admired the knowledge of that old scholar. Chen Ping'an had also stayed at the Old Dragon City's dust medicinal shop for a period of time, and he had brought the increasingly mature Pei Qian to the Azure Phoenix Nation in the southeastern region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. On the 5th day of the 5th lunar month that year, he had received the first ever birthday present in his life. The only experience he didn't write about was those few years that he had worked as a bookkeeper at Bamboo Scroll Lake. In the end, it was only after returning to his ancestral home in Clay Vase Alley and guarding the night by himself under the candlelight that Chan Ping'an had mulled over this matter for a long time, finally writing a single sentence. These few years were quite difficult to endure, but having pulled through the other end, they actually appear okay in hindsight. Chan Ping'an finished another draft and another transcription, with both tall stacks of paper being written in neat compact script. Perhaps his characters would still appear very basic in the eyes of expert calligraphers, and disregarding the contents, the 300,000-odd characters appeared rigid and compact from the beginning to the end. They were written in a proper manner but nothing more than that. Chan Ping'an put away the ink and the calligraphy brush, extending his hands and placing them on the two stacks of paper that looked like books that were yet to be bound. He gently straightened the stacks and lightly pushed down. There was nothing for him to worry about for the moment, so he allowed his mind to drift far away. When he returned to his senses, Chan Ping'an placed the two stacks of paper in his pocket treasure before standing up and starting to practice fist techniques, combining 3 stances together as usual. Right now, he spent roughly half his time practicing fist techniques as a martial artist and half his time refining qi as a qi refiner. Thus, finding time to draw talismans was his biggest source of recreation. After purchasing 2 newspapers, Chan Ping'an didn't come across any trouble as he arrived at the immortal ferry station of the Dragon Palace Small World. Similar to the Jewel Small World in his hometown, the Dragon Palace Small World was also one of the 36 small worlds. This small world was owned by the Water Dragon sect, with the old ancestor of the Water Dragon sect first discovering and occupying the small world. However, the Dragon Palace Small World was strongly coveted by many people, resulting in 2 significant periods of turmoil that had included both internal troubles and external threats. It was only after the Water Dragon sect reached an agreement with the Great Origin Empire's esteemed Mystery Department and Duckweed Sword Lake that it was able to enjoy the bountiful profits of the Dragon Palace Small World in peace. The Water Dragon sect was an ancient sect with a long history in the northern complete reed continent, with many anecdotes relating to it. On the other hand, the Great Origin Empire's esteemed Mystery Department and Duckweed Sword Lake could only be regarded as young powers compared to the Water Dragon sect. Right now, however, these 2 young powers enjoyed far more renown than the Water Dragon sect. There was a restriction formation set up around the Water Dragon sect located on the water side, so the passengers on the immortal ship were unable to see the silhouette of the immortal sect, instead only able to see the bank of the large river. Hazy mist enveloped an area of 50 kilometers in radius, and only when the immortal ship sailed through the large formation of thick fog that lingered all year around and slowly descended toward the ferry station were the passengers finally able to see the magnificent structures of the Water Dragon sect stretching into the distance. For the first time since taking immortal ships in the northern complete reed continent, Chan Ping'an discovered that all of the passengers were obediently leaving the immortal ship on foot after it docked at the station. However, considering the domineering nature of the Great Origin Empire's Imperial Lu clan, the stories and rumors about the Yang clan of the esteemed Mystery Department's lofty Cloud Palace, and Chan Ping'an's personal experience with Sword Immortal Li Kai of Duckweed Sword Lake, this no longer seemed as surprising as it initially appeared. There were 1,000 or so immortal mandarin trees planted at the Water Dragon sect's Wood Slave Ferry Station, with all of them personally planted by the founding ancestor of the sect. Before passing away, the old ancestor had said that his achievements were mediocre, with only 1,000 wood slaves to give to his disciples. Dressed in azure with Sword Immortal on his back, a sword nurturing gourd by his waist, and a bamboo hiking pole in his hand, Chan Ping'an slowly walked through the large ferry station that had an archway at the entrance. Engraved on the archway were several characters personally written by a calligraphy sage from the Middle-earth Divine Continent. Underwater Small World. The river grew extremely wide at the ferry station, reaching an astounding width of 150 kilometers. The Dragon Palace Small World was located underwater, similar to the Dragon Palace of Verdant Bamboo Lake. However, cultivators didn't need to swim to visit this small world, thanks to a long underwater bridge that the Water Dragon sect had spent a huge amount of resources to build. Visitors could walk along this bridge to reach the Dragon Palace Small World, and they would, of course, need to pay 10 snowflake coins to enjoy this privilege. However, if visitors wanted to proceed further and enter the small world, which legends claimed had 1,000 flood dragons in the ancient past. With these flood dragons venturing out to manipulate the clouds and rain, then they would need to pay an additional lesser heat coin. This was clear extortion. Upon thinking of the 100-eye Taotai Dao robe that he had grabbed from the lofty cloud palace's Yang Ningxing, however, Qian Pingyan felt like he could perhaps endure the pain and part with some immortal coins. At Skeleton Shoal's malicious Ghost Valley, there was young heavenly lord Yang Ningxing from the lofty cloud palace's Yang clan. On the border of the Five Mountain Nation there was Sui Jingcheng, the direct disciple of Duckweed Sword Lake's sword immortal Li Kai. In that immortal ruin there was Bai Bai, the direct disciple of the Water Dragon sect's ancestral hall, who had been standing beside young feudal lord Zhan Qing. On the path of cultivation, those relationships and threads appeared like a tangled chaos, with each knot, no matter how big or small, being another encounter. This gave people the misconception that heaven and earth were only so big. The Wood Slave ferry station was bustling with people, so noisy that it didn't appear like an immortal ferry station at all. Instead, it appeared more like a flourishing street in Immortal City. This was because the 10th of the 10th and the 15th of the 10th were both very important days. This was the case outside the mountains, and it was also the case in the mountains. One day was a ghost festival, one of the three largest, and another day was the birthday of the water official Great Emperor, a Taoist official. The Water Dragon sect would host 2 Taoist ceremonies in the Dragon Palace Small World, with these ancient ceremonies highly respected and acclaimed. According to the year, the cultivators of the Water Dragon sect would host either a Gold Edict, a Jade Edict, or a Yellow Edict ceremony, helping all beings pray for fortune and ward off disasters. The second ceremony, the birthday of the water official Great Emperor, was of utmost importance to the Water Dragon sect due to this ancient deity overseeing the many gods and deities of the water. Apart from the magnificent archway, Qian Pingyan discovered that the style and layout of this ferry station were slightly similar to the ruins of that immortal abode, with dozens of engraved stone steels behind the archway. Perhaps regions near large rivers and with a strong affinity to water all followed these same customs? Qian Pingyan looked over the stone steels one by one, a choice that proved to be popular with many other people. There was a large number of traveling Confucian scholars as well, and these scholars who appeared to be from Confucian academies were all putting their heads down and transcribing the stone inscriptions next to the stone steels. Qian Pingyan carefully read over the record of virtuous individuals constructing the stone bridge from the Daping period, as well as the Drowning Dragon Pavilion, written by a local calligraphy sage from the northern complete reed continent. This was because these 2 stone inscriptions offered a detailed explanation of the construction process of the underwater stone bridge, also recounting the origin and rise of the Dragon Palace Small World. The line was as long as a snaking dragon, and Qian Pingyan waited for almost an entire hour before finally seeing the cultivator who was responsible for collecting the entrance fee for the Water Dragon sect. He handed over 10 snowflake coins and obtained a seal engraved from immortal mandarin wood, one that had an ancient style and was engraved with top-notch seal script characters. The cultivator from the Water Dragon sect informed Qian Pingyan that he could return this seal to the cultivator on the other end of the stone bridge. This was the first time Qian Pingyan had seen a wood seal from an immortal force in the mountains. The character on the bottom of the seal was rest, and the characters on the side of the seal were fame and fortune pertain to the body, life and death pertain to destiny. After reading this, Qian Pingyan asked whether these wood seals could be purchased. The female cultivator from the Water Dragon sect smiled beautifully and replied that these mandarin wood seals were tokens for crossing the bridge and belonged to the sect, so they were all recorded and traced and weren't up for sale. However, there was a shop inside the Dragon Palace Small World that especially sold all kinds of different seals, with various types of famous stone seals in addition to the unique mandarin wood seals of the Water Dragon sect. Thus, this guest could definitely find a suitable seal when he entered the Dragon Palace Small World. Qian Pingyan was just about to inquire about the price of the mandarin wood seals in the Dragon Palace Small World. However, the people lining up behind him had already started to grumble in annoyance, scolding him and telling him to piss off. They hadn't come here to watch him flirt with a celestial maiden. Qian Pingyan had no option but to turn around and apologize, following which he hurriedly left the line and made space for the next person. Qian Pingyan felt a slight sense of disappointment. Items being sold in immortal shops were often quite expensive, and the larger the immortal force was, the more difficult it would be to find a bargain. Meanwhile, there had still been some opportunities to find bargains at the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent's Green Beetle Shop, Wasptail Ferry Station's Cloth Wrapper Shop, and similar immortal shops at smaller ferry stations. The long and extremely wide stone bridge had the ability to repel water, and even though it was a stone arch bridge, the arch was actually upside down. It was said that the central point of the bridge was already close to the bottom of the large river, another remarkable property of the bridge. Stepping onto the bridge meant walking into the large river. The wide bridge was bustling with people and horses, appearing even busier than the main streets in the capitals of the mortal empires. From this, it could be seen that the water dragon sect was making huge amounts of money every single day simply by collecting an entrance fee for the stone bridge. Chen Ping'an looked up, gazing at the distant and limpid color of the large river. This was unlike the murkiness of ordinary rivers. The bridge was approximately 150 kilometers long, so visitors could hire horses and carriages at each end to help with the journey. There was an endless stretch of abodes and buildings at the other end of the stone bridge, and each end of the bridge was also guarded by an old ancestor at the unpolished jade tier. Because of this, the water dragon sect was often split into the northern sect and the southern sect. The ancestral hall was located to the north of the large river, and it had formerly been one of the 3 ancient shrines of the Plenty River. As a result, it was said that the disciples of the northern sect were haughty and conceited, causing an invisible barrier to subtly form between them and the southern sect, despite both being from the water dragon sect. Chen Ping'an could understand this. As long as a matter wasn't too major, it was inevitable for people to indulge their nature and behave in this manner. Perhaps the same would happen if Liu Baixiang established an immortal force outside Downtrodden Mountain in the future, and perhaps Liu Baixiang's direct disciples would also feel uncomfortable when they visited the ancestral hall at Downtrodden Mountain at that time. How to prepare for future troubles was one of the sternest examinations for the culture and tradition of an immortal force. Reading books to understand past people and past matters, and observing other people to observe oneself, this was presumably the purpose of reading a myriad of books and traveling to a myriad of places. No matter how much someone racked their brains, there were many matters that they couldn't comprehend and truly understand through imagination alone. Even if they managed to make some inroads, their comprehension would inevitably be shallow and abstract. Just like Cui Dongshan had said, these good principles would crumble at the first blow once they were spoken and placed in the world that was rife with material desire. Would this not be disappointing? Some people experienced many things, yet they were unable to properly sift through these matters and identify one or two overarching threads. After drifting aimlessly with the crowds, they would console themselves by thinking that this was the inescapable nature of the world. This was out of helplessness, but it would ultimately still be a shame. Regarding these gains and losses, Chen Ping'an was still walking slowly and still contemplating unhurriedly. No matter how rare and unique the scenery of the stone bridge through the large river was, it would still become ordinary and unremarkable after walking several dozen kilometers. Even though there were strange fish that were as bright as lanterns, as well as many subordinate entities of river gods and river guardians drifting around, one would still lose interest in them after seeing them again and again for dozens of kilometers. Chen Ping'an noticed that almost everyone was in high spirits for the first dozen or so kilometers, looking around everywhere and standing in front of the stone railings to gaze into the distance, being as loud and boisterous as could be. However, they would gradually fall quieter as they walked forward, until only the clip-clopping hooves and the trundling wheels could be heard. As he walked along the long stone arch bridge, Chen Ping'an's biggest interest was the side patterns and the engraved characters on the mandarin wood seals hanging by the waists of the other visitors. He committed all of them to memory. If the immortal mandarin wood seals in the Dragon Palace Small World were too dear, then he would purchase some fine mandarin wood to craft his own. After walking 50 or so kilometers, Chen Ping'an saw a dozen odd tea stalls and restaurants on the bridge, similar to the roadside pavilions on the mountain and river paths. Chen Ping'an entered a restaurant that was 5 stories tall and asked for a pot of the water dragon sect's specialty immortal wine, midnight wine, as well as 2 plates of snacks. However, only after paying some extra was he able to get a window seat with a good view of the scenery outside. The first level was extremely full, and just as Chen Ping'an was about to sit down, a waiter quickly walked over with a group of customers, asking with a smile whether it was okay for them to share this table. If Chen Ping'an agreed, then the restaurant would give him a bowl of midnight wine for free. Chun Ping'an looked at the group of people, 2 men and 1 woman, and thought that they didn't look sinister or aggressive. The young man and the young woman were neither pure martial artists nor qi refiners, and they instead looked like descendants of wealthy clans. Meanwhile, the old retainer standing beside them was approximately a 6th-tier martial artist. Chun Ping'an agreed to the request, and the young man smiled and nodded in thanks. Chun Ping'an raised his wine bowl in acknowledgement. In reality, the higher up one went, the better the scenery would be. This was simply a matter of paying more. However, after traveling 50 or so kilometers and having seen all of the scenery along the large river, it would be an absolute waste of money to pay more for better scenery. Of course, there was a great number of people who didn't treat immortal coins as money. Chun Ping'an silently drank wine and listened to the conversations of the other customers. Paper couldn't contain fire, and even though the Emperor of the Great Seal Script Empire had strictly forbidden the results of that battle from being disclosed, the many people and the numerous pairs of prying eyes had meant that all kinds of information were gradually spread and disclosed, eventually culminating in detailed articles in the newspapers. And thus, the battle and deaths of Ape Call Mountain Sword Immortal Jiyu and the 10th tier martial artist, Guyu, became a topic for discussion among cultivators from the mountains, with these conversations becoming increasingly common and spirited. When that great sword immortal from the northern region had died in battle at the Sword Chi Great Wall before, people had released swords after news reached the northern complete reed continent. Jiyu was also a sword immortal from the same continent, yet news of his death, especially the fact that he had died at the hands of a pure martial artist, was treated with a complete lack of respect, even in the immortal newspapers. There was no attempt to respect the dead and honor his title. In turn, the discussions between the cultivators also became increasingly crude and wanton. The opinions in the restaurant were almost completely one-sided. Even sword cultivators were praising Great Grandmaster Guyu, while they only had ridicule and anger reserved for sword immortal Jiyu. Guyu's fist technique was godly, yet he didn't have any disciples to inherit it. On the other hand, Jiyu had left behind a relatively powerful Ape Call Mountain. There were many disciples in this immortal force, but it was facing the challenge of the younger generations being inferior to the older generations. Indeed, there was currently no upper 5-tier sword cultivator guarding the immortal force anymore. When Jiyu was still alive, a single immortal tier sword cultivator had been more than enough. Following Jiyu's death, his reputation and former might as a lofty sword immortal had seemingly become an unforgivable crime. Great sword immortal? What a load of nonsense! Someone exclaimed in anger. He didn't dare to go to the Sword Chi Great Wall to kill demons, and he was even killed by a martial artist in the end, losing all face for sword cultivators like us. Someone nodded in agreement, sneering. People claim that Jiyu had only just advanced to the immortal tier. But if you ask me, I'd say that he didn't reach the immortal tier at all. Rather, he was an unpolished jade tier sword cultivator the entire time, and he simply gave himself the title of Great Sword Immortal. Someone expressed great pity for his misfortune but also expressed deep annoyance at his lack of fight, commenting, even though his opponent was one of the 4 great N-tier martial artists of the continent, Jiyu's death was still very vexing. His bonded flying sword was actually restrained by Guyu, allowing the martial artist to destroy his body with a single punch, shatter his golden core and nascent soul with the second punch, and directly kill him with the third punch. Jiyu was the mighty sword immortal of Ape Call Mountain, so how could he be so careless? It's a good thing that he didn't go to the Sword Chi Great Wall, or else he would have embarrassed himself even more, causing the sword cultivators there to mistakenly think that sword immortals from the northern complete reed continent are all as flashy but useless as Jiyu. A short moment later, a cultivator who had some ties with Ape Call Mountain spoke up in indignation, exclaiming, the entire continent was aware of Sword Immortal Ji's cultivation base, so why taunt him in a condescending manner after his death? Where were you hiding before? Someone clicked their tongue in wonder and remarked, oh my, a friend of Ape Call Mountain has finally come forward to speak up for them. Another person purposely lowered their voice and warned with a faint smile, we need to be careful. Ape Call Mountain's Jiyu has many friends. Yet here we are making unfavorable comments about him. This will lead to people forcing us to obediently shut up. The rules and regulations of Ape Call Mountain are lofty and domineering, and the speed of their swords is even quicker. How truly terrifying. Yet another person quickly concurred with this, asking with a cold chuckle, "What's this? Ants like us are only allowed to praise great sword immortal G. But we're not allowed to speak our actual thoughts? Such arrogance and haughtiness from Ape Call Mountain Sword Cultivator. Such incredible might. Outsiders like us aren't allowed to make a single fair comment." Chen Ping'an drank wine and gazed at the flowing river outside, appearing like an old mute who hadn't spoken for hundreds upon thousands of years. Someone directly smacked their table and stood up, retorting, "How can there exist such fragile sword immortals in the world? Do you people not use your brains before you speak? Or perhaps you feel confident that you could have one if you were to face Senior Guyu instead?" Another customer immediately bit back, slamming their wine cup into the table and asking with a loud laugh, "Ha ha ha, what's wrong? I'm not allowed to speak reason simply because I'm not a sword immortal? Then apart from that small handful of people, should everyone else in the northern complete reed continent shut their mouths? There exists such a rule in the world? Perhaps reason also exists in a shop, and this shop is opened by Ape Call Mountain." Chen Ping'an smiled and didn't say anything. These people indeed seem very reasonable. The small number of cultivators who were defending Jiyu and Ape Call Mountain all felt extremely aggrieved and stifled. Meanwhile, many more people felt extremely satisfied, loudly asking the restaurant for a few additional pots of midnight wine. After taking large swigs of this fine wine, some people directly tossed unopened pots of wine outside the restaurant, saying it was a shame that they hadn't been able to encounter Senior Gu in their lifetime, nor had they been able to witness that deadly battle at the Jade Seal River. Even though they were cultivators who looked down on martial artists from outside the mountains, it was only right that they offered a pot of wine to martial artist Guyu. The three people on Chen Ping'an's table talked quietly amongst themselves. "Wei Qi, are the cultivators from Ape Call Mountain truly so arrogant and unreasonable? Why are they being insulted by everyone?" the young female asked in a quiet voice. Wei Qi shook his head and replied with a smile, "They're actually not too bad. After all, which sword cultivator's immortal force doesn't have a temper? However, Ape Call Mountain's reputation is a bit worse than that of the Great Emblem Sword sect in the north. Will it be interesting to insult that martial artist Gu Yu?" the old retainer asked in an indifferent voice. As Qi refiners, only by insulting the great sword immortal and praising the martial artist can they appear bold and unique. What about the cultivators who are criticizing sword immortal Jiyu the most vigorously? Do they have bad blood with Ape Call Mountain? the young woman asked in curiosity. Wei Qi shook his head and chuckled. If they truly have bad blood, they won't express their feelings publicly after learning of Jiyu's death. Those who feel resentment and are willing to loudly voice their thoughts are never the same people as those who bear life and death grudges. Rather, these people are barely acquainted with the target of their insults, but their words are most able to poison the minds of the onlookers around them. This is the same everywhere. In the mortal streets and markets, in the imperial courts and scholarly circles, and in the mountains and the martial world. At the end of the day, this is nothing special after witnessing and hearing about these matters many times. Chen Ping'an glanced at Wei Qi and the young woman who wanted to speak, but couldn't help but hesitate. He warned using his mind's lake. Cultivators have sharp hearing, so please be careful with your words, young master. Wei Qi smiled and nodded in response, actively raising his wine bowl at the young man in azure and replying with his mind's lake. That's only reasonable. We'll focus on drinking and stop discussing these contentious matters. Chen Ping'an was slightly surprised. Wei Qi was actually a qi refiner with a decent cultivation base? Chen Ping'an genuinely hadn't noticed this before. In reality, Wei Qi was also feeling quite stunned at this moment. The young wanderer carrying a sword on his back looked like a 4th or 5th tier pure martial artist, but in fact he was actually a qi refiner as well. In the large dining hall on the first level of the restaurant, several people who weren't acquainted with each other quickly found a common interest, with all of them boisterously condemning Jiyu and Ape Call Mountain. They raised their wine bowls high into the air to toast each other. Chen Ping'an was even able to see the sincerity in their eyes, and the exuberant expressions on their faces as they drank weren't a facade. This was the most interesting part. Chen Ping'an didn't have any complaints about these people. Living in this world, people should loudly voice their thoughts if they were displeased. Few things would genuinely be heinous, and these matters would quickly pass and be forgotten after being said. These lively occasions and bold condemnations were a good companion to go along with some wine. There was someone else whom Chan Ping'an was keeping an eye on, a person who spoke in a flawless manner and didn't voice such extreme opinions. This person sounded much more understanding and reasonable. As people spoke, it was as if there were sages and deities wandering through the night, and it was also as if there were a myriad of ghosts wandering through the day. Travelers retreated when they heard about great demons in the mountains and wilderness, avoiding commotion and trouble. The water ghosts in the rivers were bewitching, swaying gracefully as they dragged their victims into the water. The customers on the second floor of the restaurant were also chatting about matters pertaining to the mountains, but compared to the loud and argumentative nature on the first floor, these people were chatting in their own groups and didn't purposely suppress their voices. Thus, Chan Ping'an heard some people talking about Qi Jinglong entering seclusion, and he also heard people speculating on which 3 sword immortals would challenge the Great Emblem Sword sect. There were conversations about the battle between Huang Shi and Xiaonyang on Temper Mountain, and there were discussions about the rapid rise of the Refreshing sect. Of course, there was also chatter about the young female sect leader, who had claimed that she already had a Dao partner. Chan Ping'an could hear people discussing business on the 3rd floor, with their transactions large but their voices soft. These transactions could easily lead to profits or losses of several thousand snowflake coins. The conversations on the 4th floor started to become unclear, with many immortal restriction techniques blocking the prying ears of eavesdroppers. Chan Ping'an naturally wouldn't pry into people's private matters without permission, so he simply listened to what he was able to hear. He could vaguely hear people discussing the great trend of the Eastern Treasured Vile continent, talking about the Northern Mountain and Weibo. Many more people were exchanging thoughts about the Pure White continent and the Middle Earth Divine continent. For example, there were speculations about whether Chao Ci, the young martial artist from the Great Duan Empire, had advanced to the Vajrabhati tier yet. And how old would he be when he advanced to the N tier of martial arts? As for the 5th floor at the top of the restaurant, there was only the occasional sound of wine cups and wine bowls lightly clinking against each other. Chan Ping'an leisurely drank his 1 pot plus 1 bowl of midnight wine before standing up and walking over to the front counter to pay. He then left the restaurant by himself. He didn't forget to nod in acknowledgement to the 3 people at his table before leaving, and Wei Qi also smiled and raised his wine cup in acknowledgement. Chan Ping'an walked along the stone arch bridge stretching endlessly through the middle of the large river. An extravagant carriage suddenly charged into his vision, boldly trundling down the middle of the bridge. These were evidently members of a powerful and wealthy clan enjoying an outing, with an elder dressed in purple robes and a jade belt holding a ritual baton in his hand. There was also a deity in silver armor holding an iron spear, as well as a female deity in white surprisingly exuding 2 trails of light from her eyes as she looked around, with these trails lingering in the air for a long time. These beings were the water immortals and water monsters recorded in the unofficial historical texts, and they resided in the Dragon Manor, and were responsible for managing the calm wind and gentle rain of a region. The entrance to the Dragon Palace Small World was located somewhere on the other end of the bridge, which was only 25 kilometers away. As its name suggested, the Dragon Palace Small World was a legitimate ruin of a dragon palace. According to the records on the stone steels, this region had indeed been home to primordial water immortals and coiling flood dragons in the past. Compared to the Flood Dragon Trench, which was filled with various descendants of flood dragons, this dragon manor was like an immortal abode in the mountains, while the Flood Dragon Trench was like a force in the martial world. Chan Ping'an saw the outline of a city wall, and when he drew near he saw a plaque with the golden characters, Plenty River Summer Residence, hanging from the building atop the city wall. Below this largest plaque were layers upon layers of other plaques, with these dozen or so plaques displaying the calligraphy works of some renowned individuals. There were works of talismanic immortals, and the spirit light contained inside the talismanic cores of these plaques didn't dissipate for hundreds upon thousands of years. There were also works of sword immortals, with their plaques holding an abundant amount of sword intent. Most probably due to the high entrance fee of 1 lesser heat coin, the line at the city wall couldn't come close to comparing to the bustling crowds at the other end of the stone arch bridge. Small worlds like the Dragon Palace Small World, that had been managed for hundreds upon thousands of years by immortal sects, wouldn't have any fated opportunities left over for the later generations, especially if they were outsiders. This was because even if a natural treasure were born in the small world, it would be reserved and watched over by the water dragon sect straight away, with no one else allowed to touch it. Even if the water dragon sect, a powerful local force, were unable to repel the coveting of some lofty passing immortals, there were still the lightning techniques of the lofty Cloud Palace's Yang clan and the flying swords of Duckweed Sword Lake to deter these immortals. Looking at the history of the Dragon Palace small world, there had once been a huge commotion caused by the theft of a subjugation treasure. In the end, the three forces had worked together to retrieve the treasure, discovering that the thief was a completely unexpected, yet also entirely understandable person. The culprit was a renowned sword immortal, and this person had disguised himself as a steward of the water dragon sect, remaining concealed in the small world for several dozen years. Even so, they had still failed to escape with the paramount water fortune treasure, and were forced to hand it back before they could even take a good look at it. The sword immortal was lucky to escape alive after being pursued by the old ancestors of the three sects, and after fleeing to the pure white continent, they became a guest elder of the divinely wealthy Lu clan. Even until now, they still didn't dare to return to the northern complete reed continent. Chun Ping'an was just about to hand over a lesser heat coin when someone unexpectedly whispered in a quiet voice, "There's no need to pay. You should save money whenever you can." Chun Ping'an was delighted as he turned around, but he didn't call out this person's name. However, the joy in his eyes couldn't be concealed. It was surprisingly Li Lu, who should have been cultivating at Lion Peak. When reuniting with Li Baoping and the others at the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy back then, Li Huai had said that his big sister had become a cultivator at Lion Peak, carrying water and tea and running errands for the old immortals in the mountains every day. As for his parents, they had opened a shop in the market at the foot of the mountain, earning a lot of money and giving him confidence for being rich enough to get a wife in the future. What a coincidence, Chun Ping'an chuckled. I was planning to visit Lion Peak and look for you and your parents after I finished traveling around the Plenty River and wandering around Infant Mountain. Li Lu shook her head lightly and replied with a faint smile. No, it's not a coincidence. I especially came here to look for you. Chun Ping'an wanted to say something, but he couldn't help but hesitate. In the end, he chose to swallow the words that had already reached the tip of his tongue. Li Lu was clearly a successful cultivator, one who had already reached an incredibly high cultivation base. However, this thought disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Li Lu retrieved a hornless dragon jade tablet that was olden style in appearance, and the cultivator of the water dragon sect who was responsible for guarding the city gate immediately bowed in respect at the unfamiliar young woman after taking a glance at it. Li Lu directly entered the city gate with Chun Ping'an, walking up a set of white jade stairs that stretched further than the eyes could see. When Chun Ping'an looked back, he saw that the city gates had seemingly been placed under martial law, with no one else allowed to enter the Dragon Palace small world. Meanwhile, the group of people in front of them had already become as small as specks of sand as they continued to ascend the white jade stairs. Mr. Chun, Li Lu called in a soft voice. Just call me by my name, Chun Ping'an hurriedly said. My temporary name is Chun Haoran. Li Lu's glistening eyes curved into crescents as she smiled. Chun Ping'an also felt like he was being a little too shameless, and he thought to himself whether he should choose another pseudonym instead. However, he eventually said, Then just call me Mr. Chun. Li Lu nodded in response, and her first remark carried immense weight. Mr. Chun, it's best that you advance to the Vajrabhati tier as soon as possible. Otherwise, if you're too late, unforeseen events will take place at the Golden Armor continent. Chun Ping'an hesitated for a moment before replying, I'll try my best. Li Lu's second remark directly caused Chun Ping'an's Dao heart to become unstable. Zhang Dafeng sent a letter to Lion Peak before, so I paid a visit to Downtrodden Mountain. The Lotus Flower blessed land has been split into 4 now, with Downtrodden Mountain obtaining one part of it. That parasol leaf umbrella is the entrance, and Julien and the others are desperately trying to raise this blessed land, which they've temporarily named the Lotus Root Blessed Land, into a medium-grade blessed land. Otherwise, the blessed land will go to waste. As such, they need 2,000 to 3,000 grain rain coins. Chun Ping'an's expression became stiff as he asked carefully, Grain rain coins? Li Lu nodded and replied, Grain rain coins. Chun Ping'an sighed in grief and lamented, I can't gather that many immortal coins even if I sell all of my belongings. Only at this point did Li Lu roughly explain Zhu Lian and the others' plan to Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an breathed a small sigh of relief. Being able to borrow money was also a good ability. Zhu Lian already had some regulations in place regarding whom to borrow from, how much to borrow, and how to repay these debts. Chen Ping'an didn't have any objections after carefully listening to Li Lu's explanation, and he felt comfortable that there wouldn't be any oversights with Zhu Lian leading the matter and Wei Bo and Zheng Dafeng helping him come up with different strategies. The key point was that the heavy burden of the debt of 2,000 to 3,000 grain rain coins would ultimately fall on his shoulders, that of the young mountain master. This was something he couldn't escape from. Of course, Chen Ping'an wouldn't try to escape from this responsibility in the first place. He was already starting to think like an accountant, reconsidering the wealth he had accumulated during his current trip through the northern complete reed continent. He had gone from picking up trash to peddling goods as a wandering merchant, so if he sold everything that he possibly could, how many grain rain coins would that give him? Disregarding the grain rain coins that Downtrodden Mountain had already borrowed from the various different forces, could Chen Ping'an muster together enough grain rain coins to make up for the existing gap in required funding? The answer was a very simple no. When Chen Ping'an returned to his senses, Li Lu changed the topic and revealed. In the beginning, the Jewel Small World's entrance was actually very similar to that of the Dragon Palace Small World. I was never able to walk along it. The Jewel Small World had already fallen to the ground and taken root when I eventually left my hometown. Chen Ping'an replied in disappointment. Care to sit down for a chat? In any case, there's no one walking up the steps from behind us, Li Lu suggested with a smile. Chen Ping'an sat down on the steps without hesitation, grabbing his sword nurturing gourd and drinking a sip of wine. He could only drink rice wine in the future. The jade tablet I possess means that the cultivators of the Water Dragon sect won't use immortal observation techniques to spy on us without permission, Li Lu said. Chen Ping'an still didn't ask any questions. In reality, he only had a very shallow impression of Li Lu. She was Li Huai's older sister, and she was the person whom Lin Shui and Dong Shuijing both liked. The two of them had never spoken much with each other before today. Li Lu hesitated for a moment before saying, Mr. Chen, I have an immortal rubbing of an enchanted picture scroll, and this is something that's slightly related to you, but not very much. I initially didn't plan to give it to you, worried that it would cause additional problems and delay your travels. Chen Ping'an felt slightly puzzled, and after thinking about it for a brief while he replied, That's okay. Since I'll learn about this sooner or later, it's better that I learn about it now so I can start to make some plans. Li Lu retrieved an immortal treasure that looked like a calligraphy work from her sleeve, gently tapping it with her finger as it hovered in mid-air. There was a ripple as mist permeated into the surroundings. A young woman who was sitting upright appeared on the calligraphy scroll. She was going by the pseudonym Shi Qiu, and she was a cultivator in a small immortal force in the eastern treasured Vile continent. However, she actually hailed from the northern complete reed continent Ceremony Mountain, and she had worked as a maidservant on the intercontinental ship that had plummeted to the ground and been destroyed in the eastern treasured Vile continent's luminous Vermilion Empire. Li Lu gazed straight ahead, staying out of this matter. She had experienced far too many joys and sorrows, separations and reunions in the world, so she seldom felt any emotions regarding these matters anymore. The final scene of the enchanted picture scroll rubbing was the young woman, who was seeking death, picking up an embroidered pouch that she had carefully looked after for many years. Her face was scrunched up, and she was seemingly holding back tears as she squeezed out a smile and gently waved the embroidered pouch back and forth, saying in a soft and gentle voice, Oi, that person Qiu sure liked you. Do you hear? Do you see? If you're not aware, then that doesn't matter. If you're aware, then just being aware is good enough. Chen Ping'an quietly sat on the white jade steps, listening to every single word of her story. She was Chen Shui, Qiu Shi's older sister. Chen Ping'an was able to recognize her straight away. In the end, Chen Ping'an murmured, Okay, I'm aware now. There was a long period of silence. Li Lu retrieved the calligraphy work and placed it back inside her sleeve. Chen Ping'an retied the sword nurturing gourd to his waist, and there didn't appear to be any grief or anger on his face. Li Lu didn't find this strange. She simply said something that sounded very cold and unreasonable, commenting, Things have already come to this, so her decision to expose the truth is meaningless beyond asking for death. Chun Ping'an nodded and concurred. That's normally the case. Is there a not normal case? Li Lu asked. Chun Ping'an didn't offer an answer, and he turned around and said, I plan to make haste and keep traveling, so I won't stay here and look around the Dragon Palace small world. In any case, it's not like I can afford to purchase anything here. However, will doing this cause you any trouble? There's no need to worry, Mr. Chun, Li Lu replied with a smile. I don't have any troubles in the northern complete reed continent. At the very least, I can protect myself without issue. Chun Ping'an said he planned to make haste and keep traveling, but he didn't show any signs of standing up straight away. He recalled the couplet that he wanted to hang up inside the bamboo building at Downtrodden Mountain in the future. The first couplet read, a meter-long sword amid the wind and rain outside the mountains, brandishing the sword and leaving the mountains when matters arise. And thus Chun Ping'an moved sword immortal from his back to his waist. This was seemingly Chun Ping'an's first time genuinely carrying a sword by his side. He had already grown accustomed to carrying swords on his back. Mr. Chun, you're not going to directly point your sword at Ceremony Mountain, then challenge the Great Li Empire, and finally challenge Heavenly Lord Xiesher, are you? Li Lu asked. In reality, Li Lu wasn't very fond of people who use swords, regardless of whether they were primordial deities or modern cultivators. She couldn't stand the sight of them. Chun Ping'an stood up and waved his sword nurturing gourd around, chuckling. No, I won't. My abilities are lacking, so I'll drink wine to cope. Li Lu nodded with a smile, remaining seated and not standing up to see him off. She simply watched the young man dressed in azure and carrying a sword by his waist slowly walking down the white jade stairs. What to do when problems arise? Grab one's sword and walk down the mountains. What if these worldly matters were greater than one's ability? Nothing could be done, and the answers could only be temporarily kept in one's mind, and the sword could only be temporarily sheathed in its scabbard. There was a lot of commotion at the city gate of the Dragon Palace small world because no one else was allowed to enter following the entrance of a young man and a young woman. Even the gatekeeper, a water element cultivator from the water dragon sect, was unable to notice the specks of golden light flowing out from the many plaques and hovering to the ground, gathering together like fireflies and transforming into a young man wearing a tall hat and loose-fitting robes. This young man strode through the city gates, after which they closed behind him. The gatekeeper was at a complete loss, what with this being a peculiar sight not seen in 1,000 years. He immediately sent a messenger flying sword to the ancestral hall of the Water Dragon sect's northern sect. Not long after Chun Ping'an walked down the white jade stairs, the young man appeared beside Li Lu and kowtowed at her following an ancient etiquette. His voice was also hoarse and ancient-sounding, with his words obscure and difficult to understand. This was in stark contrast to his appearance. Li Lu remained sitting on the stairs, gazing at the disappearing figure of the young man walking down the mountain. Presumably annoyed at the kowtowing young man being in her way, Li Lu lightly waved her hand and moved the young man, who had just stood up, 3 meters to the side. He stood up straight, not feeling the least bit embarrassed or angry about being treated with such disdain and neglect. Instead, he glanced at the minuscule figure in the distance that was just about to reach the city gate, saying in a soft voice, "His great Tao possesses strong affinity with water. This is quite impressive." He hadn't dared to spy on the white jade stairs without permission, so he was simply regarding the young swordsman in azure as one of Li Lu's go-pieces. Li Lu's expression was apathetic as she said slowly, "Li Yuan, looking at the 3 shrines of the Plenty River, the incense offerings at your middle shrine are far inferior to the incense offerings at the upper shrine at the Great Origin Empire's esteemed mystery department. I've failed to meet the lofty expectations and I deserve to be punished by death." The strange young man called Li Yuan replied in guilt and shame. There had once been 3 shrines located along the Plenty River that stretched across the northern complete reed continent from the east to the west. The lower shrine had already disappeared long ago, while the middle shrine had been refined into the ancestral hall of the Water Dragon sect, and the upper shrine had been taken over by the Yang clan of the esteemed Mystery Department's lofty Cloud Palace. Li Lu had met with Yang Ningxing at Skeleton Shoal's malicious Ghost Valley before, revealing some information that he hadn't dared to believe, but had no choice but to believe. As the eldest direct son of the lofty Cloud Palace, and as the older brother of young Heavenly Lord Yang Ningxing, Yang Ningxin had managed to become one of the top 10 young cultivators of the northern complete reed continent as nothing more than a pure martial artist going by a pseudonym. However, facing Li Lu at Treasure Mirror Mountain, Yang Ningxin wasn't completely powerless, but he indeed had zero chance at victory against the young woman who had only just returned to the path of cultivation for a mere few years. Failed to meet the lofty expectations? Was it a lofty expectation for you to oversee the incense offerings at this small shrine? Li Lu asked. Li Yuan was rendered speechless. His golden eyes appeared slightly dull, causing him to look even older than he actually was. The ancient deity who had the appearance of a young man but exuded an aura of decay and vicissitudes was one of the two remaining water officials of the Plenty River. In fact, he was most likely even older than the founding ancestor of the Water Dragon sect. In the majestic world, water officials belonged to an ancient and little-known category of officials that were yet to go extinct, and they were often the individuals responsible for overseeing the incense offerings in the temples and shrines of large rivers. The scholarly temple in the Middle-earth divine continent seldom paid any attention to these water officials, leaving them to their own devices most of the time. Thus, looking at all of the water officials of the large rivers in the world, the decay and collapse of each godly body would signify the loss of one water official from the world. Water officials weren't bound by the control of mortal empires, nor did they have many interactions with immortal forces in the mountains. However, water officials were extremely lofty and important deities with clear lineages in the heavenly world, which was overseen by the Taoist sect. There was only a single water official for each large river, and the loftiness of their statuses was far superior to that of river gods and lake lords. In fact, even the formal gods of the mortal empire's 5 mountains couldn't compare to these water officials. On the surface, it appeared as if the Water Dragon sect had refined the shrine of the Plenty River, and used it as the foundation of the sect, relying on it to grow and repel the many haughty sword cultivators of the northern complete reed continent. In reality, however, there were far more internal secrets. Li Yuan was like a lowly petty official of an imperial court who was fortunate enough to come across a paramount pillar official as he stood in front of the extremely noble young woman, so how could he not be immensely respectful and careful? Being reprimanded for his performance was also a great blessing from the heavens. The Water Dragon sect was large, yet very few people were aware of Li Lu's true identity. There was only Li Yuan, the measly water official, as well as the sect leaders of the Water Dragon sect who learned this from their predecessors. The hornless dragon jade tablet looked like an ordinary jade tablet that the Water Dragon sect issued to guest elders and direct disciples in the ancestral hall, but in reality, all of these jade tablets were actually exquisite replicas of the jade tablet in Li Lu's hand. The gatekeeper from the Water Dragon sect was unable to tell the two apart, but Li Yuan could discern them with ease. Thus, even though the appearance and the status of the young woman had changed in this lifetime, Li Yuan had still hurried over straight away after detecting the hornless dragon jade tablet. Li Lu suddenly started to smile. The young man whom she had never met and never interacted with in their hometown, the Jewel's small world, had actually noticed Li Yuan's presence the instant that he had appeared. However, Chen Ping'an continued to quietly descend the mountain, not once looking back to observe the water official. Li Yuan was a bit tactless, and he didn't deactivate the restriction straight away, forcing Chen Ping'an to wait around near the city gates. Li Lu thought for a moment before saying, "This works as well. Having Mr. Chen stay here for a few days will help him calm down and stabilize his mind." This was Li Lu's first time looking at Li Yuan properly, and she continued, "Li Yuan, are there any areas with abundant spiritual energy that are relatively peaceful and quiet? If there are, then let our esteemed guest enjoy some good hospitality. If there aren't, then have someone offer up their spot for a while." Li Yuan nodded and replied, "There are. There had to be some even if there weren't any." This was someone whom Li Lu was referring to as Mr. So if it weren't for being afraid of causing too much commotion, Li Yuan, the gatekeeper of the Dragon Palace Small World and the water official of the Plenty River's Middle Shrine, even wanted to shoo everyone out of the small world. Did he care that the Water Dragon sect was going to host a Jade Edict ceremony, or a water official ceremony? Did he care that shooing everyone out would infuriate the Earth Immortals who were cultivating in the small world? "Don't reveal anything to the Water Dragon sect for the moment," Li Lu instructed. "Just tell them that a descendant of an old friend has come to visit. Of course, you can offer another explanation if you can come up with a better one. In any case, just don't let anyone disturb Mr. Chen's peace and quiet in this small world. Li Yuan bowed and cupped his fists, replying, "Understood." Li Lu stood up and strode forward, directly arriving at the city gate in a single step and saying, "Mr. Chen, it will be a slight pity if you travel past one of the 36 small worlds but don't enter. There are many natural treasures accumulated inside the Dragon Palace small world, especially treasures possessing a strong affinity with water or wood. These treasures are very dear, but their quality is remarkable. If Mr. Chen takes a fancy to any of these treasures, using this jade tablet will allow you to take out a debt with the Water Dragon sect, as long as the treasure costs under 100 grain rain coins." Li Lu didn't tell the truth. Take out a debt? The Dragon Palace small world, which earned an incredible amount of immortal coins for the Water Dragon sect, the esteemed Mystery Department, and Duckweed Sword Lake, had actually been one of Li Lu's summer palaces in the past. Moreover, if Li Lu wanted to regain control of this small world, did it matter how masterful the refinement techniques of the Water Dragon sect's old ancestors were? Did it matter that the mountain and water formation, which the sect had established with much effort and difficulty, could block the attacks of sword immortals? In any case, how had the founding ancestor of the Water Dragon sect transformed from an untalented mortal into a cultivator? How had he managed to come across those fated opportunities and soar to the heavens? Were the subsequent sect leaders of the Water Dragon sect not aware of this? That being the case, who owed a debt to whom? This was abundantly clear. Right now, Chen Ping'an would feel terrified whenever he heard the words grain rain coin. Li Lu was in no hurry to remove her jade tablet and hand it to Chen Ping'an, and she said, "If Mr. Chen can't calm his mind, then you'll only be going in circles no matter how far you travel." Chen Ping'an nodded and replied, "Okay, then I'll be troubling Miss Li." Li Lu shook her head and chuckled. "There's no need to be polite, Mr. Chen. Li Huai has been thinking about Mr. Chen for many years, and he mentions Mr. Chen each time we exchange letters from Mountain Cliff Academy and Lion Peak. Li Lu doesn't dare to forget the huge debt of gratitude we owe Mr. Chen for being a guardian and teaching Tao to Li Huai." "Miss Li is far more polite than me," Chen Ping'an replied. This was the truth. He had only been upholding a promise when looking after Li Huai and accompanying him to the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy back then, and apart from being slightly more mischievous, Li Huai hadn't caused him too much trouble. Of course, when Li Huai was little, his tongue had truly been coated in honey but also dipped in arsenic, especially when it came to his unrivaled ability to act as a little tyrant both at home and among his friends. Even so, he was fundamentally a pure and kind child, not able to hold grudges but able to remember other people's kindness. Chen Ping'an raised his head and looked up, but the figure of that strange young man was already nowhere to be seen. "That person is the gatekeeper of the region," Li Lu explained. "Similar to Zheng Dafeng?" Chen Ping'an asked. Li Lu smiled and replied, "Their positions are relatively similar, but compared to Uncle Zheng, the gulf between them is like the gulf between heaven and earth." Thinking back to when her younger brother was still a little child, Zheng Dafeng had often carried Li Huai on his back and brought him to the Yang family's medicine shop. Li Huai would holler that he couldn't hold it in anymore, and Zheng Dafeng would be as swift as the wind as he sprinted forward, hurriedly telling the little boy that he should hold it in for a while longer if he were a true hero. He could relieve himself when they arrived at the backyard of the medicine shop. However, regardless of whether Li Huai managed to hold it in or not, the man and the little boy would eventually make their way to the pastry shop on Dragon Riding Alley anyway. Li Lu had come across many peaceful and pure cultivators in her long life, with these individuals being flawless and unsullied as they transcended above mortal matters. It was only when staying in the Jewel's small world in this life that she had come across many genuine people, with their state having nothing to do with their cultivation bases. This was a small place with grand scenery, and even Li Lu had to think about it with longing from time to time. The two of them walked side by side as they ascended the white jade stairs again. After discussing the proper matters, it was as if there were nothing else for the two of them to discuss. Chen Ping'an had too much to think about and found it difficult to say anything, lest he accidentally drag Li Lu into some unnecessary trouble. Meanwhile, Li Lu always thought about very little, paying no heed to the myriad of matters around her. Die. After the ancestral hall of the Water Dragon sect's northern sect received the messenger flying sword from the entrance of the Dragon Palace small world, more than half of the 16 chairs in the hall were already occupied. The empty chairs belonged to the powerful cultivators who were currently traveling outside the mountain. Apart from a nascent tier cultivator who had already been cultivating in seclusion for many years, everyone else who could make it to this urgent meeting had already taken their seat in the ancestral hall. Among those inside the ancestral hall was Sun Jia, the sect leader of the Water Dragon sect, and the Dao mentor of the Golden Courtier Bai Bai. There was also Wu Lingting, the esteemed mentor of the Northern Pavilion Nation's young feudal lord Zhan Qing. However, as a relatively inexperienced nascent tier guest elder and a vagrant cultivator, his seat was naturally closer to the end. Wu Lingting was in a terrible mood lately, with his only disciple unexpectedly vanishing from the world, his body or corpse nowhere to be seen. This was absolutely preposterous. If it weren't for spiritual master Huan Yun, a talismanic cultivator who had a fairly good reputation in the mountains, speaking up for that young lady Bai Bai, and helping to prove her innocence and lack of direct involvement in relation to Zhan Qing's mysterious disappearance, Wu Lingting would have directly caused a ruckus in the ancestral hall of the Water Dragon sect and demanded an answer from Sun Jia. With this weighing on his mind and a ball of fury burning in his chest, it was only natural that Wu Lingting's expression was absolutely livid at this moment. Zhan Qing was an extremely prized disciple of his, and compared to official immortals taking disciples, it was actually far more significant when vagrant cultivators took disciples, especially with Wu Lingting being an earth immortal vagrant cultivator. This could be viewed as vagrant cultivators taking a huge risk and sacrificing half their life to gamble on their lineage being passed down. After all, it wasn't abnormal for vagrant cultivators to trick and kill fellow vagrant cultivators, even if it were masters killing their disciples or disciples killing their masters. On the other hand, almost no official immortals who belonged to immortal sects with ancestral halls dared to commit such heinous and blasphemous crimes. The gates to the Dragon Palace small world had closed by themselves. This naturally wasn't a small matter. Sect leader Sun Jia immediately gathered together the members of the ancestral hall. Back then, a sword immortal had disguised themselves for many years and stolen a subjugation treasure from the Dragon Palace small world, even managing to successfully escape from the small world afterward. From losing their prized treasure to snatching it back, the process had been nothing short of bloody and tragic. There were a dozen or so seats in the ancestral hall of the Water Dragon sect, and apart from the left head chair being reserved for the sect leader, the right head chair was almost always empty. However many years the ancestral hall of the sect had existed was however many years this rule had been passed down, firm and unaltered. This was a taboo subject for the cultivators of the Water Dragon sect, regardless of which guest elder of the sect asked about it. The current situation was very simple. Sun Jia was able to explain it in a few brief sentences. However, everyone in the ancestral hall had solemn expressions. It was first an unfamiliar young woman showing her guest elder jade tablet and entering the city gates to ascend the white jade stairs, following which the city gates had closed and sealed the region off from the rest of the Water Dragon sect. Not only that, but the cultivators of the sect were surprisingly unable to observe what was going on inside. Xiao Jingji, a graceful and young-looking female unpolished jade tier cultivator from the Water Dragon sect's southern sect, slowly suggested, "Sect leader, how about I immediately make a trip to the sea of clouds beyond the ferry station of the small world to guard the area and wait for the culprit to show up?" Sun Jia furrowed his brows and replied, "Apart from this, what we really need to consider right now is whether or not we need to place the entire small world under martial law. Once we do so, it's inevitable that panic will spread and speculations will swirl, affecting this year's Gold Edict ceremony and Water Official ceremony. Our Water Dragon sect has always been renowned for its stability and safety, and disregarding our good friends from the mountains, many officials and generals from the Great Origin Empire will also be participating in these two ceremonies. If we're not careful, we'll be giving ammunition to the esteemed Mystery Department and Duckweed Sword Lake. These short-life profligates from outside the mountains have little in the way of capability, but are each more smooth-skinned and fragile than the next." Wu Lingting sneered. An old woman who had her eyes shut and was resting her hands on a dragon-head walking stick looked like she was nodding off and half dead. It was clear that she was a cultivator from the southern sect, given that she was sitting beside Xiao Jingji. At this moment, she opened her eyes the tiniest bit and turned around slightly to face sect leader Sun Jie, saying in a hoarse voice, "Junior nephew Sun, if you want my opinion, I'd say that we directly have Jingji bring the paramount treasure of the sect with her and kill all of the ill-intentioned people that she comes across. I find it difficult to believe that anyone can cause significant commotion in our Dragon Palace small world." Wu Lingting was sitting opposite this old woman, and he felt slightly impressed by her bluntness. They were both at the nascent tier, but she was disgruntled with everyone whom she saw in the sect. Moreover, she relied on her higher seniority to refer to sect leader Sun as junior nephew Sun, while she referred to the southern sect's Xiao Jingji as Jingji, clearly showing whom she was closer to. Fortunately, Sun Jie was a magnanimous person. Otherwise, if Wu Lingting were the sect leader of the Water Dragon sect, he would have pulverized the face of this old woman a long time ago. Just as Sun Jie was about to speak, specks of golden light appeared on the right headchair beside him, eventually gathering and transforming into a young-looking man with a haggard expression. It was none other than Li Yuan, the water official of the Plenty River. Li Yuan bowed to Sun Jie, making sure to adhere to the proper etiquette. Sun Jie also stood up and bowed in response. However, he didn't reveal Li Yuan's identity. The old woman suddenly opened her eyes and said in a quivering voice, "Mr. Li? Is it Mr. Li?" Li Yuan felt slightly sentimental, taking a glance at the white-haired old woman but not saying anything. The rims of the old woman's eyes surprisingly became red, and she no longer rested her hands on her dragon head cane. Instead, she gently leaned it against her chair and placed her hands on her knees, straightening her dress, and looking down at her shriveled fingers. "Mr. Li is still as elegant as always, but it's a pity that I've already grown old, far too old," she murmured softly. "When Mr. Li wasn't present, I was always eagerly looking forward to seeing you again, waiting until my hair became gray. After seeing Mr. Li, however, I've finally come to understand that not seeing you might have been better." There was an amused smile on Wu Lingting's face. What was this all about? An elegant young man and a waning old woman. Perhaps they had experienced a marriage together in the past? That would genuinely be an old and interesting story. This was the interesting thing about the mountains. Strange matters were never all that strange. As long as cultivators had enough spare time to nose around, there would always be lively and interesting matters for them to witness. Li Yuan used his mind's lake to speak frankly to Sun Jie, saying, "Sect leader, the descendant of an old friend has come to visit, and their jade tablet is one that I gave out in the past. I went over to reminisce about old times with them, and I channeled a technique because I didn't want to be disturbed by other people. However, my actions have clearly alarmed the Water Dragon sect and resulted in this gathering at the Ancestral Hall. This is my fault, and I'm willing to accept punishment according to the ancestral rules of the Water Dragon sect." Sun Jie smiled faintly and replied, "You're exaggerating, water official. Since the descendant of an old friend has come to visit the small world and form another positive relationship, that's naturally a good outcome for water official Li, and by extension, a good outcome for the Water Dragon sect. Why don't the two esteemed guests go to my residence in the small world's main city to rest?" Li Yuan smiled and said, "There's no need to trouble, sect master. I'll bring the two of them to Paddling Island." Sun Jie nodded and offered, "Please let me know if you need anything, esteemed water official." Li Yuan stood up and cupped his fists in apology to the cultivators in the Ancestral Hall, saying, "Apologies for making everyone gather here and disturbing your cultivation. I'll make sure to provide compensation in the future." After saying this, he transformed into specks of golden light and instantly disappeared from the Ancestral Hall. To easily appear and disappear in the Ancestral Hall of a sect like this was a clear display of strength. This was because any cultivator or guest elder of an immortal force in the mountains was required to enter the Ancestral Hall on foot. This was identical to the Ancestral Halls in the mortal world. Add to that the position of the water official's seat and the old woman from the southern sect losing her composure. Xiao Jingji and the other cultivators in the Ancestral Hall all understood the lofty nature of this person's status. Thus, no one expressed any irritation or anger when Sun Jie smiled and said, "It was just a false alarm. Let's conclude this meeting." Heavens knew whether that elusive young man liked to bear grudges. The more kindly and amicable an elder in the Ancestral Hall appeared, the more difficult to deal with they would usually be. Sun Jie was the last person to leave the ancestral hall, and Xiao Jingji was quietly waiting for him outside. After everyone else soared away on the wind, Sun Jie smiled and revealed, "Your guess is correct. He's water official Li Yuan, and he oversees the incense offerings of the Plenty River. He was a very good friend of the water dragon sect's founding ancestor." There was a gloomy look on Xiao Jingji's face. To put things bluntly, was the structure behind her truly the ancestral hall of the water dragon sect? All of the elders in the ancestral hall appeared lofty and powerful, but in reality, all of them were stuck in the awkward position of being at the behest of someone else, including her and sect leader Sun Jie. Sun Jie appeared casual as he replied, "When you drink water, think of its source." Xiao Jingji's expression became stiff as she nodded in response. Sun Jie smiled and said, "Establishing an immortal force isn't easy, and maintaining it is also difficult. Jingji, there are some things that we can fight over without issue. After all, it will all stay within our immortal force. However, if someone oversteps the boundary, I can still muster my courage to pull them in line. Regardless of how incapable I am, and how I'm regarded as the most useless sect leader of the Water Dragon sect. At the very least, I'm a sect leader who's pored over the ancestral rules again and again." Xiao Jingji's expression became increasingly grim as she flew away on the wind, soaring over the Plenty River and directly returning to the southern bank. Sun Jie was clearly using the water official of the Plenty River to threaten her and the entire southern sect. Sun Jie didn't channel an immortal technique. Instead, he used his hands to close the doors of the ancestral hall. He slowly walked down the mountain. There were countless matters to manage in the sect. There was almost no time for him to rest and relax. For example, Wu Lingting had been filled with resentment before, so Sun Jie had agreed to let him have the first choice in picking an unofficial disciple the next 3 times that the ancestral hall recruited disciples. Wu Lingting hadn't held back, directly asking Sun Jie how the problem would be resolved if he coincidentally chose a talent that Xiao Jingji and the southern sect had been keeping an eye on. Sun Jie had responded to the vagrant cultivator guest elder's question by stating that the southern sect was also a part of the water dragon sect. Only after hearing this did Wu Lingting feel slightly satisfied. In reality, however, promises were easy to make, but they were far more difficult to follow through on. A single mistake could give rise to a conflict between the northern sect and Xiao Jingji's southern sect, driving a deeper wedge between the two. The conflict between the Water Dragon sect's northern sect and southern sect wasn't a recent phenomenon, having gradually formed over a long period of time. Moreover, there were both benefits and drawbacks to this conflict, with some past sect leaders choosing to suppress the conflict and some choosing to foster it. The conflict wasn't all bad. However, many disciples of the northern sect viewed the issue through very simple lenses, thinking that the conflict was caused by sect leader Sun Jie's lack of influence and might. It was because of this that the southern sect located to the south of the Plenty River was able to grow so powerful. This was the reason behind Sun Jie's warning to Xiao Jingji today. Li Yuan concealed himself in the sea of clouds above the small world. He sat cross-legged and peered down at the green snails in the jade plate. Residing in the mountains close to the clouds and streams, hundreds of years could pass in the blink of an eye. A white-haired old woman renowned for her eccentric nature in the Water Dragon sect stood atop the mountain peak of her residence and gazed up at the sea of clouds, appearing adrift with a gentle expression on her face. It was unknown what this elderly female cultivator in the mountains was looking at. Li Yuan didn't look at her. He simply had vague recollections of an introverted and unsociable little girl from many, many years ago. She hadn't been adorable at all, and she had even liked to wander around by herself in the rippling stream at night, carrying a large pile of stones in her arms and shattering the moon's reflection in the water. Die. Chan Ping'an turned around, noticing that the city gates had finally opened again, allowing visitors to ascend the white jade stairs. He and Li Lu finally reached the peak after climbing 9,999 steps, and what appeared before them was a tall and white jade platform that occupied an area of more than half a hectare. There were engravings of dragons on the ground, and the 16 coiled dragons looked like a wall of white jade dragons laid flat on the ground. However, in stark contrast to the harmonious aura of most dragon engravings in the world, 12 of the dragons were shackled by iron chains and impaled by blades, with their expressions reflecting agony and struggle. Chen Ping'an carefully avoided stepping on the dragons, while Li Lu didn't show any fear at all, directly stepping on the heads and bodies of the flood dragons. She smiled and explained, "The dragons under Mr. Chen's feet are all criminals and convicts from ancient times. They're no longer legitimate true dragons, so there's no taboo about stepping on them when we walk." True dragons were responsible for controlling the clouds and rain in the ancient past, able to accumulate merit and virtue through these deeds, and allowing them to receive clearly defined promotions and rewards. Of course, they would also be punished for their wrongdoings, with punishment ranging from having their tendons ripped out and their skin peeled off on a dragon-slaying platform, having their claws and head cut off, or having their body and soul confined. If their crime were more severe, then they would be executed, with their corpses directly thrown into the rivers. If their crimes didn't justify death, then they would be stripped of their statuses and have their blood soak the mountains and rivers. This then led to the appearance of many descendants of true dragons. "Are they still alive?" Chen Ping'an asked in a quiet voice. "Most of them are as dead as can be, unable to withstand the brutal flow of time," Li Lu replied. "A few of them are still hanging on by a thread, with the dragon wall on the ground acting as both a prison and a protection for them. Of course, death will essentially be inescapable if this small world shatters one day. In this sense, they can be viewed as guardians of the water dragon sect, allowed to break free for a brief moment if a powerful enemy challenges the sect, and they receive a command from the ancestral hall. They can participate in the battle, and they can be regarded as relatively loyal. The water dragon sect has always treated them well because of this, replenishing the water fortune essence of the dragon wall each year, helping the imprisoned flood dragons stay alive." Chen Ping'an became increasingly curious about Li Lu's vast experience and knowledge. However, it was never good to ask too many questions about these matters. Everyone had their own secrets, and if two people were friends, then one person being willing to share their secrets with the other person was a display of trust, something that the recipient needed to respect and safeguard. They needed to protect these secrets, not dig deeper into them in a wanton manner simply because they were friends. They further couldn't reveal these secrets as a means to make new friends. Thus, some people looked like they had many friends able to drink wine with people wherever they were. It was as if their life were filled with banquets and gatherings. Once they encountered difficulties, however, they would be left without a single friend once they departed from the banquet table. They could only resent the ice-cold nature of the world. If a person didn't treat their friends with sincerity, how could they expect to receive sincerity in return? This was the reason why seemingly clever and shrewd people had few friends during times of need. As if reading Chen Ping'an's thoughts, Li Lu revealed honestly, "There was a good reason why my parents and I moved to the northern complete reed continent. The environment here is more suitable for my cultivation, and it would have been almost impossible for my father to advance any further if he had stayed in the eastern treasured vile continent. It's also difficult here, but there's at least some chance of success." The size of a continent would often decide the number of upper 5-tier cultivators that could exist. The northern complete reed continent was vast and rich in treasures, with the spiritual energy in this continent far more abundant than that of the eastern treasured vile continent. Thus, there were far more upper 5-tier cultivators in the northern complete reed continent compared to the eastern treasured vile continent. However, there wasn't a big difference in the number of mountain summit tier martial artists, and especially the number of N-tier martial artists. Including Guyu, who had recently perished alongside Jiyu, the northern complete reed continent only had 3 N-tier martial artists. Meanwhile, the eastern treasured vile continent, the smallest of the 9 continents, also had 3 N-tier martial artists. Li Huai's father Li Er, the Great Li Empire's Song Chongjing, and Downtrodden Mountain's Chui Cheng. Following Guyu's death, there was now an opportunity for all of the martial artists in the northern complete reed continent to obtain a share of the continent's martial fortune. As for how much they could obtain, this was naturally up to the ability of each person. This was the reason behind the saying, "The death of a mountain summit tier martial artist benefits their nation, and the death of an N-tier martial artist benefits their entire continent." "Mr. Chen, did you recently visit a mystical realm that was similar to a small world?" Li Lu suddenly asked. Chen Ping'an nodded and replied, "I recently traveled through an ancient ruin that doesn't appear to have any records." "Then it's no wonder," Li Lu said. "When Guyu passed away, most of his martial fortune dispersed throughout the continent, But an abundant cloud of martial fortune appeared slightly mystical, seemingly containing some of Gu Yu's lingering thoughts as it hovered around the northern pavilion nation and the celestial water nation for a long time, only dissipating slowly after approximately 5 days. This is most likely because it was unable to find Mr. Chun. If Mr. Chun had obtained this gift, then you would have enjoyed a greater chance of successfully advancing to the Vajrabadi tier, as the strongest 6th tier martial artist. Even if that martial artist at the same tier in the Golden Armor continent continues to grow his fist intent, it most likely wouldn't have affected Mr. Chun too much. However, it's quite difficult to say now. If his fist techniques continue to improve, while Mr. Chun stagnates, and if Mr. Chun breaks through the barrier to the 7th tier before he does, then you would have lost that fated opportunity. Chun Ping'an came to an understanding. It was because he had practiced the mountain-shaking fist for so many years, and because he had faced the 3 punches and received guidance from Senior Gu Yu. Thus, Senior Gu Yu was still willing to bequeath him a portion of martial fortune even though he was an outsider on the continent. Chun Ping'an naturally felt some disappointment about failing to accept Gu Yu's bequeathment, but he didn't feel any regret. Holding the green hiking pole in one hand and lightly clenching his other hand into a fist, Chun Ping'an replied, "This doesn't matter. Senior Gu Yu is from the northern complete reed continent, so it's only right that his martial fortune is passed on to the martial artists in this continent. Only by practicing fist techniques more diligently can I live up to Senior Gu Yu's expectations." To Chun Ping'an, this bequeathment could be separated into 2 types. He had failed to capture the martial fortune, but he needed to firmly grab the kind intent. True reason was to remain calm and composed, separating matters and clearly understanding what to take and what to give up when faced with situations that detrimentally affected one's interests. Li Lu smiled and said, "Mr. Chun being able to think like this means that Gu Yu has very good judgment, and my younger brother Li Huai also has fairly good judgment." Chun Ping'an always felt like there was something off about Li Lu's way of speaking, but it also seemed completely natural and right at the same time. When he recalled the traditions and customs of his hometown, however, he felt like there was nothing to be surprised about. Just looking at Clay Vase Alley, where his ancestral residence was located, there was the Southern World Continent Sword Immortal Chao Shi, Bamboo Scroll Lakes Gu Kan, and of course Chun Ping'an. Other visitors gradually arrived at the tall platform, so Chun Ping'an and Li Lu stopped discussing these matters. When there were 16 people on the platform, 16 snow-white flood dragons that were condensed from clouds and mist appeared around the platform. When their heads approached the platform, it was as if the misty flood dragons were each an immortal ship. 16 people can ride these flood dragons each time, allowing them to ignore the restrictions of the small world and smoothly enter the Dragon Palace small world, Li Lu explained. This can be regarded as a gimmick of the Water Dragon sect. Li Lu was the first to step onto the head of a flood dragon. Chun Ping'an copied her actions and lightly stepped onto the head of a misty flood dragon. A person who had arrived later wanted to push forward and step onto a flood dragon first, but just as they raised a foot, the ethereal body of a deity in azure materialized on the platform and said, "A deep pit exists beneath this platform and is filled with the corpses of those who tried to push forward in line. Each person can consider how important life and death are to them." Perhaps only Chun Ping'an was able to notice the positioning of this deity in azure, and how he was standing closest to Li Lu. The 16 snow-white flood dragons formed from misty water fortune slowly rose into the air, but just as they were about to soar through the thick sea of clouds and allow the visitors to vaguely see the speck of golden light hanging high in the sky, the flood dragons suddenly plummeted down without warning. There were only hazy clouds and mists in the surroundings. Li Lu maneuvered the flood dragon under her feet to arrive beside Chun Ping'an, and she said with a faint smile, "The speck of golden light above us is the embryo of a sun formed from the incense offering essence gathered and condensed from the Plenty River's middle shrine. It's also a core part of the Water Dragon sect. However, its growth is slow due to the incorrect method being used, with its shape also as crude and unrefined as can be. The wrong path was chosen from the very beginning, and based on the speed of the middle shrine's accumulation of incense offerings, the Water Dragon sect won't see any success even if they're given another 10,000 years. The possibility of the cultivators of the Water Dragon sect constructing a sun and moon in the Dragon Palace small world is even smaller than the possibility of them snatching the sun and moon from the shoulders of the pure Confucian, Chan Chunan. Much, much smaller. Chan Ping'an looked around, and all he could see was the unending sky above and the bottomless sea of clouds below. He couldn't see that speck of golden light. If I were a cultivator of the water dragon sect, I would probably choose to do the same thing as well, Chan Ping'an murmured to himself. Even if it's only a speck of light, I would still be willing to continue accumulating incense offerings. Mr. Chan, the cultivation of chi refiners is slightly different from the cultivation of martial artists. It's not that one can't cultivate slowly and steadily in the simplest manner, but if this is the only pursuit of chi refiners, then it's certain that they won't succeed. Even if chi refiners enjoy a longer lifespan, they still won't be able to sit for extended periods of time in the mountains for too many times. I'll remember this, Chan Ping'an nodded and said with a smile. Approximately 15 minutes later, the misty flood dragon rocked gently and placed its 4 feet on the ground. The clouds and mist in the surroundings dispersed, causing the view to open up before them. Chan Ping'an discovered that he was standing atop a sea of clouds. Looking down, what he saw was a majestic city constructed on a gigantic island, appearing like the capital of an empire that was surrounded by green mountains and iridescent light. There were other islands of varying sizes around the gigantic island with the majestic city, with these islands each having ancient structures built near mountains or built near water. They looked like stars surrounding the bright moon, protecting the capital that was seemingly at the center of the world. The rippling dark green water stretched for as far as the eye could see. Numerous dark green talismanic boats were hovering above the sea of clouds, with some as small as awning boats and some as large as luchuan and battleships. Water official Li Yuan was sitting nearby. Li Lu and Chan Ping'an walked toward the young man whom even the elders in the ancestral hall of the water dragon sect weren't familiar with. Li Yuan led the two of them toward a luchuan, and after boarding, the luchuan started to move by itself even though there didn't appear to be any cultivator steering it. There's abundant water fortune and spiritual energy at Paddling Island, and seeing that it's already been empty for 100 years, Mr. Chan can stay there and cultivate there. Moreover, it isn't too far from the old palace either, only being 1 hour away by talismanic boat, Li Yuan said in a soft voice. Thank you for your hard work, Li Lu said with a nod. Li Yuan felt slightly uneasy. Is there a need to organize some dexterous maidservants for Paddling Island? Li Yuan asked in a careful voice. Why are you asking me? Ask Mr. Chan. Li Lu responded. Li Yuan immediately turned around to ask Chan Ping'an. Chan Ping'an smiled and replied, I'm already troubling you a lot, so there's no need to go to more trouble. Li Yuan didn't say anything else. There was a tall and slightly out-of-place building atop the sea of clouds. There was a nascent tier cultivator responsible for guarding this area standing near the railings on the top level, and he retracted his surveilling gaze when he saw the hornless dragon jade tablets hanging by the waists of the young woman and the young man. Even so, he couldn't help but feel slightly puzzled. He was familiar with almost all of the guest elders of the water dragon sect, so why were both of these cultivators unfamiliar faces? Perhaps they were cultivators who had close relationships with the esteemed Mystery Department or Duckweed Sword Lake. In any case, the 2 jade tablets couldn't be faked, so the elderly nascent tier cultivator responsible for guarding the Sea of Clouds didn't try to cause any unnecessary trouble for himself. The luchuan surged forward like a flying sword, not heading to the ferry station of Paddling Island, but instead coming to a stop above an empty Immortal Plaza. The plaque on the Immortal residence read, Dragon Lord Stopping Clouds. The gates of the residence slowly opened as the 3 of them disembarked the luchuan and stepped onto the plaza. Paddling Island was once a place of cultivation for an old guest elder of the water dragon sect, but after he passed away, none of his disciples have achieved any sort of success, Li Yuan explained. For the sake of forcefully breaking through, one of his golden core tier disciples secretly sold Paddling Island back to the water dragon sect, and after being fortunate enough to advance to the nascent tier, he traveled away to another continent. As a result, his senior brothers and juniors had no option but to move out of the Dragon Palace small world. The 3 of them stepped over the door threshold together, and Li Yuan continued, apart from this cultivation residence, Paddling Island also has the diving pool, Eternal Joy Mountain Stone Cave, the old site of the Iron Workshop, and the 4 main tablets of Lord Immortal Ascension. There's no one on the island and no owner either, so Mr. Chan can feel free to wander around when you have free time. In the end, Li Yuan retrieved the jade tablet from his waist, one side of which was engraved with dragons and the other side of which was engraved with the ancient seal script characters "Mountains Green Rain Like Mist," and handed it to Chan Ping'an, saying, "Mr. Chan, this is the core control of the formation around Paddling Island. There's no need to refine it, and you'll be able to manipulate the formation simply by wearing this jade tablet anywhere on your body. Nascent tier cultivators will be unable to spy on the building on Paddling Island, and unpolished jade tier cultivators will cause ripples to form on the formation if they try to secretly pry on the island." Li Lu was relatively satisfied with this. This place was clearly Li Yuan's private residence. As for the ancient matters regarding an old guest elder of the Water Dragon sect passing away and his disciples facing internal strife, Li Lu naturally couldn't care less about these matters. The truth of these matters had nothing to do with her. Chan Ping'an didn't turn down the offer, and he accepted the heavy jade tablet after expressing his thanks. He then hung it by his waist beside the Mandarin wood tablet of the Water Dragon sect, the token used to cross the long stone arch bridge. Only at this moment did Li Lu grab the jade tablet with the characters 3 feet sweet rain from her waist, handing it to Chan Ping'an with a smile and saying, "Mr. Chan, just treat this as me helping my younger brother repay some of his debts of gratitude." In other words, there was no need for Chan Ping'an to return this jade tablet. Li Yuan's eyelids involuntarily quivered as he watched on. If it were him, he would most probably fall to his knees and express his deep gratitude. Chan Ping'an shook his head and said, "This gift is too valuable, so I have to return it in the future." Li Lu didn't say anything, simply handing the jade tablet to Chan Ping'an. Li Yuan didn't dare to watch any further, respectfully bidding farewell and taking his leave. And thus, there were now 3 tablets hanging by Chan Ping'an's waist. Li Lu and Chan Ping'an walked through the immortal residence together, and Li Lu planned to leave this summer palace, which wasn't worth cherishing or reminiscing about, after staying here for a brief while. After she left, how could Chan Ping'an possibly return the jade tablet? Would Li Yuan dare to accept and temporarily look after the jade tablet? Was the measly water official of the Plenty River not afraid of drowning to death? Just how many fire deities had been burned to death in the past? In the same vein, just how many water deities had been drowned to death by her in the past? Chan Ping'an retrieved a primordial lord deity statue from his minimization treasure and said with a smile, "Miss Li, I was planning to give this to Li Huai the next time I met him, but how about you help me pass it on to him instead?" Li Lu's expression immediately became soft and gentle, and it was as if she had instantly transformed back into the young girl who had carried a bucket to the ancient well in the small town each day. She appeared lithe and fragile, and it was as if she would never be anything but smooth. She accepted the small present and held it up, waving it around and remarking in amusement, "See, I'm different from Mr. Chan. I'm never overly polite when it comes to accepting valuable presents, and I even feel like it's natural and justified." Chan Ping'an also became slightly more relaxed as he chuckled, "I do need to take a leaf out of Miss Li's book." Li Lu couldn't help but sigh with emotion as she looked at the warmly smiling young man. When her younger brother had embarked on a distant journey to a foreign land back then, he had appeared like the most ordinary child out of everyone from the private school. He couldn't compare to Li Baoping, Lin Shuyi, Yu Lu or Xie Xie. Chan Ping'an had treated Li Huai in a normal manner during their journey to the Great Sui Nation. After the appearance of her father, Li Er, Chan Ping'an had still treated Li Huai in a normal manner. And now that Li Lu had appeared at the Water Dragon sect, he was still treating Li Huai the same as always. She was Li Huai's older sister and Li Er's daughter, but regardless of her cultivation base and her experiences, Chan Ping'an would still try his best to avoid causing trouble for her. He would be happy if she were doing well, but that was all there was to it. To treat others with generosity, and to exercise self-restraint and discipline. This was the sign of a true scholar. Even if he weren't a genuine teacher today, he would definitely become a genuine teacher in the future. With this in mind, Li Lu smiled and said, "Lest Mr. Chun think I can only deliver some bad news, there are 2 things that I must congratulate Mr. Chun for." Chan Ping'an's eyes lit up upon hearing this. Perhaps the requirement of 2,000 to 3,000 grain rain coins for the Lotus Root blessed land was an overestimation by Downtrodden Mountain? This sword has actually been a celestial tool for a period of time already, Li Lu revealed. Chan Ping'an immediately faltered when he heard this. Golden sweet wine, the Tao robe that he had obtained from the Flood Dragon Trench, could be evolved into a celestial tool through feeding it a large number of gold essence copper coins. Chen Ping'an had understood this from the beginning, and he was simply yet to make this a reality. However, how had Sword Immortal suddenly gone from being a pseudo-celestial tool to being a fabled celestial tool? Li Lu revealed the secret, saying, "The sword has a wisp of righteous aura, and it also has a speck of pure Tao intent." Chen Ping'an fell deep into thought. The latter was understandable, since Sword Immortal had refined the shattered sword qi gifted to him by Taoist Master Sunday. However, what was the explanation for the righteous aura? Li Lu didn't say anything else regarding this matter, changing the topic and continuing. Also, Mr. Chen doesn't need to worry about anything while staying at Paddling Island. You can feel free to extract the surrounding water fortune and spiritual energy, and the Dragon Palace Small World won't care at all about this small expenditure. In any case, this portion belongs to Paddling Island to begin with. There's another piece of news that can't really be regarded as good news. I've asked that person called Li Yuan to help deliver a letter to the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent's downtrodden mountain. He won't leave behind any traces at all. Li Lu stopped and said, "I'm going to wander around the main city of the Dragon Palace for a while." Chen Ping'an nodded and replied, "Miss Li definitely has to notify me before she leaves the Water Dragon sect. That way, I can return the Jade Tablet to Miss Li." Li Lu didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. Chen Ping'an also didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. Sure enough, he had guessed correctly regarding Miss Li's secret plan. Li Lu nodded and said, "All right, I'll visit Paddling Island before I leave." Chen Ping'an didn't keep her any longer after receiving this confirmation. Li Lu transformed into a streak of light and soared away, not causing a ripple of single spiritual energy amid heaven and earth. As she soared through the sky, her aura was identical to that of Sword Immortal Li Kai. Chen Ping'an started wandering around the residence by himself, preparing to find a tranquil area that was suitable for cultivation. After finding a location that he was satisfied with, he would visit the diving pool and the Immortal Ascension tablets. Li Lu had silently dashed into the sky, after which she had gracefully landed back near the residence. She then made her way toward the sea of clouds again. She regarded this as having upheld her promise to Chen Ping'an. Water official Li Yuan was standing at attention amid the sea of clouds. "How are things at the ancestral hall of the Water Dragon sect?" Li Lu asked. "Everything has been resolved," Li Yuan replied succinctly. Li Lu smiled and said, "Li Yuan, you've at least earned some credit for your hard work." Li Yuan responded with a wide smile. "There's something between you and that old woman?" Li Lu asked. As long as Li Lu was in the Dragon Palace Small World, her mystical abilities would be superior to all ordinary sages. Li Yuan shook his head and sighed. "It's my fault for pretending to be a water ghost and frightening that young girl all those years ago." Li Lu immediately lost interest upon hearing this. After instructing Li Yuan to look after Mr. Chen as he cultivated, she casually opened the sky and left. When she dashed into some region of the Plenty River through a boundary that was connected to the small world, she traveled hundreds upon thousands of kilometers in an instant, quicker and more inconspicuous than any land-shortening immortal technique. Any river, lake or sea in the world was a territory and a small world of Li Lu's. In reality, Li Lu was perhaps the most qualified person in the world to provide feedback and suggestions regarding Chen Ping'an's water palace. However, she didn't go out of her way to say anything. Chen Ping'an chose a suitable area for cultivation, after which he started to wander around by himself. After visiting the famous sites in the surroundings, he made his way back to the residence and retrieved 6 gray bricks from the Taoist temple, placing them on the ground. He then started to practice walking meditation. He hung Sword Immortal on the wall, and he rested his hiking pole diagonally against the wall. Chen Ping'an walked into the study to write a letter after he finished practicing fist techniques, discussing some matters pertaining to the Lotus Root blessed land with Zhu Lian. Of course, there were many other minor and trivial matters as well. At the end of the letter, he told Zhu Lian that he would only leave the Water Dragon sect's Dragon Palace Small World and continue his journey after he received a reply from Downtrodden Mountain. In the letter, he also claimed with confidence that, as a wandering merchant who had traveled around almost half of the northern complete Reed continent, he indeed had some treasures and immortal coins to spare. However, if Downtrodden Mountain were able to borrow money without any hidden risks or future troubles, making up for the missing amount in a timely manner, then he wouldn't sell his treasures for a low price. On the other hand, Julien didn't need to conceal anything if there still existed a gap in the required funding. He could work as a wandering merchant again in the Dragon Palace small world. In addition, the Spring Dew Gardens Pai Fu shop could also clear its stock to provide some grain rain coins to Downtrodden Mountain. After putting down his calligraphy brush, Chen Ping'an was in no rush to ask Li Yuan to help him deliver the letter to Downtrodden Mountain. He started to earnestly contemplate a matter after putting away the calligraphy brush and the secret letter. Should he refine his third bonded item in the Dragon Palace small world? He turned around and glanced at Sword Immortal that was hanging on the wall, thinking that he was already someone who possessed a celestial tool. That being the case, having a debt of a few thousand grain rain coins didn't seem like too big a deal.